Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. Very excited about today's show. Uh, I don't know how wide of an audience this topic will have, but I don't care. I think it's going to be a very high quality and deep and interesting show. Um, and let's see, I guess real quick before I bring the guests on, I'll just mention that we have Subscribestar to support the channel. Our regular subscribers, most of whom give $5 a month, are the backbone of the support of the show. So if you enjoy content, we basically are supported by subscribers like you. Um, and so you want to keep it happening and keep it getting better. Would love your support. Anyway, enough of that. Let's introduce our guests. All right. Can you hear me, gentlemen? Uh-oh. Oh boy. Okay, what's going on? Sorry, I have a problem. Okay, give me a second. Audio source. Okay, can you hear me now, Alexander?
Yes, I can hear you now. Hello, Stephen.
Okay, good. And yeah, so we have a sorry, had to play with settings at the last moment, and I had one last thing to fiddle with. Okay, so Alexander Adams. Right. So why do we have these two gentlemen? It's because we're going to talk about the art market, and so we could have had art auctioneers and art dealers and so forth. But I'm very excited to have people whose relationship with the art market, as far as I know, is primarily that they sell into the fine art market, as opposed to being dealers, speculators, etc. So we have Alexander Adams. Welcome, sir.
Hi.
And we have John D.
Hello, good evening.
Um, and Alexander Adams, we can actually prove sells into the art market because if you go to the show description, I pointed to his homepage and you'll see some of his art. John D, we just trust sells into the art market based on his word and that he acts like an artist. Maybe I don't know, um, but both of them, I think it's fair to say, have been involved with the art market for a long time. Is that right? I don't think either of you are like green in this area. Correct, Alexander?
Oh yes, yes. So that's right. Yeah, I studied fine art at Goldsmiths College in London, and I've been a professional artist since 1995. Of course, qualifications don't equal being a professional artist. You don't need qualifications to be a professional artist. And I'm sure that
Right.
the line between professional and amateur artist is something that will come up in this discussion. But yeah, I've had lots of exhibitions in galleries and museums around Europe and a couple in Russia and the USA. And I've been doing that for the last 25 years. Yeah.
Right. And so one of the things that is interesting as well about you is that in addition to participating in the market as an artist, you have written a bit about it. No books, I don't think, but as I understand, no, I'm sorry,
no.
You have written.
Yes. Yeah, two books. I'll get these out of the way.
Oh,
so
okay.
Culture War.
Yeah.
Is the first book. It's a collection of essays.
You've got to hold it right up in front of your face if we're going to see it. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Yep. Culture War.
So this is probably the book that's going to be of most interest to people because this has an essay in it on the art market. So this is actually the subject we're going to be discussing. Right. My second book is Iconoclasm, and that's all about the iconoclasm of 2020 and previous examples of iconoclasm. So yes, so the first book, Culture War, has this essay on a topic called "Why Are Artists Poor?" And it is primarily a review and an analysis of this book by Hans Abing. Yeah, who is a Dutch artist and sociologist or economist. Yeah. And this is a very useful book for discussing what is unique about the art economy.
And then Mr. D, can we hear you?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Right.
Yeah.
I can certainly hear you.
Good.
Well,
You are not green without getting too specific because you do remain sort of anonymous. You are not green to the art market, fair to say, right?
no, I'm not green to the art market. I have probably a similar history to Alexander. I got involved in it in the mid to late 1990s. I can't be terribly specific about things because that is how I roll here on the
Right.
internet.
Yep.
But yes, fair to say that I have been I have covered the waterfront, as they used to like to say. So
Well, and far less interesting than the background of the two of you, but I just thought I'd share a few things, partially because it ties in with something you just did, John D. Few connections of my own as I thought about it. One is that I dated an artist for some years, and she ended up being lead painter for an artist that I'm sure you both deeply love, Jeff Koons. She was she was a lead painter for Jeff Koons after my relationship with her. But when I had a relationship with her, she went to the New York Academy of Art, which is quite interesting because it was co-founded. But no, let me tell you the purpose. Wait. Let me tell you why it was founded, and then the surprise is who was a key figure in founding it. I'm quoting from their website. It was founded to foster a resurgence in the training of figurative and representational art. That is, the founders, it was founded in 82. The founders were concerned that people were not learning to draw anymore, in essence, right? I mean, just the sort of the classic skills. I mean, not just draw, right? But the classic skills of drawing and painting and so forth were getting lost. And they started this to save them, or help save them. And it was co-founded most notably by Andy Warhol.
yes,
Now,
Stuart Pivar and Andy Warhol. Yeah.
that would be surprising to a lot of people, I think, who don't know very much about Andy Warhol. But maybe, Mr. D, could you just, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole too deep, but briefly explain why you probably are not surprised that Andy Warhol helped found this place?
Well, I mean, this is materially we haven't got. I'm doing streams currently in the midst of doing a couple of streams on Warhol on Academic Agents channel. And so we've done the first one, but we haven't really talked about this because we haven't gotten into the kind of, I would say, the kind of deep analysis of Warhol's kind of personal character. But he was a deeply traditionalist, which is something that I think certain people in the audience are just not going to kind of believe, or it will certainly take some convincing. But in his own kind of private, life and in his own sort of taste, he was he was a deeply traditional man, and and which shows through the things that he collected and the things that he sort of privately admired. So he was also I mean, another surprising thing, there was a petition in the 80s to try to stop the restoration of the Sistine Chapel frescoes, and he was one of the signatories of that because they thought that that by cleaning it you were also removing the accrued history and such of the work. And so again, I mean, I think this sort of points to a very different aspect of this character that people aren't familiar with. But yes, I was that was one of my little facts I was going to drop on the stream. So,
right. So yeah, I shared it in part because of my quasi personal connection there, but indirect personal connection, but also because it's a chance to shill that John D. I didn't realize I hadn't finished the stream yet.
We've lost him. It was so fascinating that he's fallen asleep.
I think he's muted himself. Oh, okay.
Oh, hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Not sure what happened there. Okay. Maybe I need to keep that window forward. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Anyway, yeah, so I brought that up in part to have an opportunity to share, which I just did in the live chat. The first stream, I didn't realize it was just part one because I haven't finished it. The first stream on Andy Warhol that John D is doing with Academic Agent, I think you will find it surprisingly interesting because of that painter girlfriend. I know more about Warhol than I ought to. And I find him a very interesting character, as well as, of course, the connection to John Cage and I'm sorry, the more famous one, musician, John D.
John Cale and Lou Reed. Yeah.
John Cale, Lou Reed. Sorry, John Cale and Lou Reed. That's right. Yeah. So anyway, that's one connection. The other is that I'm longtime. I and my family are longtime friends with a world-class sculptor named Don Wiegand. And he has a fascinating studio, which is sort of a work of art unto itself. And I've spent many, many evenings there because I attended a Bible study that was hosted there for years. And so I was often around him, hearing about what his life was like in the world of art. Jumping ahead a little bit, but just to give you an idea of what the art market is like for this sculptor, the commissions that I can remember, and I know there's many more that I can't, would be the Bush family, as in like Anheuser-Busch. That's a big family here in my town of St. Louis. So that's a private family commissioning him, right? The Catholic Church commissioned him to do some work. And he has a huge statue of Mary that I particularly like. And the Olympic Committee commissioned him to do some work for the Olympics. And then another friend of ours is an art dealer, and that's why I have that dolly that I've mentioned, because that art dealer was invited to our wedding, and so of course he gave us a Salvador Dali, because that's what you do, I guess, when you're an art dealer. I don't know. Anyway, so that's my personal connection. Enough of all that. Let's jump to it. Why do people buy art? Let's start. When we think about the market, we start with, as Austrians, right? Austrian economists, we start with subjective value. People value things for some reason. And we, of course, can't divine and telepathically completely understand, but we can throw some things out, right? I'll give one and you guys comment. Social art as a social marker. Alexander?
Yes, definitely. This is particularly true if the artist is well known, even locally, not necessarily internationally. But this is definitely true. Art as a social marker is very important because it shows that you have a certain status. And it's been commented that, you have people who don't really even know much about art. They become wealthy and they buy a Warhol, for example, because it's a mark of social status. So, yeah, that's a very big impetus.
Right. So they're buying it not because they personally appreciate it necessarily. I mean, these could go together, right? But you're saying that there are actually individuals where they themselves might not even appreciate the art particularly, but they kind of think that everybody else appreciates it, or just appreciates that they have it, or something like that, right?
Yes, they know. It's like, even if you might not necessarily enjoy driving a Bentley, you might actually prefer driving, a Honda, a smaller car that is sort of more manageable, something that you're used to. The grander car has a greater status, and so yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and this has gone on for for centuries and centuries. I mean,
right.
There's always been a component of this, and it would extend beyond just the fine arts, certainly into into home decor and architecture and things like that. I mean, there was a social cachet to be gained from commissioning the right person and to to do your portrait or your house or your furniture and such. So yes.
Right, and this is where I this might be the part to bring in that old tradition of the person who funded the art showing up in the painting back in the old days, right? As some background character or something.
Yeah, virgin and child with donor, yes.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I mean, maybe we could parse that out in a different way, but to me, if you're putting yourself in the painting, that sounds like the social marker motivation, right? I don't think it's this. I don't think it's this next motivation, which would be art as an investment. Now, tell me if I'm wrong here, and this is where you guys are going to have a better sense of art history than I do. I have a sense that art as investment is a fairly modern, like art as social marker is ancient, but art as investment feels to me like something that's new. I don't think that that's happening in 1200, 1300, 1400. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, I would say that perhaps that started in around 1900, which is where you have the emergence of the international art market. And this is primarily because you Americans started to have magnates and tycoons who had large fortunes. They wanted to buy into culture. and that meant getting European culture. And of course, it was famous. There were famous cartoons all over the national presses of Europe, showing these rich Americans coming and buying all the art treasures of Europe. And they were not far wrong, although of course a lot of the works they were buying were relatively new. They were buying things like Impressionism and classics of the 19th century. But yes, they did also buy things like Van Eyck altarpieces and Greek sculpture and so forth. And this was quite controversial. But I would say that art as an investment beyond being a social marker started around 1900 with the international art market. I don't know.
I will add that there was a degree of this before that as well. I mean, if you look at sort of accounts of for instance, Charles I, buying of art from living artists of his day, but also slightly older works from from Titian and such. There was a sort of cognizance that these things that they had value, in the 18th century as well. There were, with the founding, late 18th and early 19th century, with the founding of some of the auction houses like Sotheby's and Christie's and such. There would be estate sales of works, and so yes, there was value. I don't know to what degree that people specifically collected for investment. I think Alexander is spot on that's something that I think that came with the advent of the 20th century. But there was still a kind of secondary market for artworks, and so that isn't something terribly new as well. Before that, of course, a lot of the value part of the value was placed in the actual materials that were used. So if you were going to commission an altarpiece or something, it wasn't just that it was done by the Van Eycks. It was also that it contained a certain amount of gold leaf. It contained a certain amount of ultramarine blue. There was still
marble.
A kind of marble. That
right.
if it was a book, it was a book binding. Jeweled binding, things like that. So there was still a kind of index with the actual value of the materials put into the object, which is something that kind of went away.
Right.
as we approach modernity, but
except for Goldschlager, right? Sorry, bad joke. Okay, so right, so art is social marker, art is investment. I've left out the obvious one, which is people do buy art just because they like the art, right? As an aesthetic and decision. Right?
Yeah, and also especially before the 20th century, people were buying portraits. Of course, because it was
right.
Before the advent of photography, it was the best way of recording someone. Also, there was a sort of, you'd also get sort of like landowners, especially English landowners. They would have also paintings made of particularly famous animals, that were sort of outstandingly large or handsome, or race horses. So, for example, that had won particular races and were highly esteemed in their time. So they would want a record of those for not only for themselves but for their ancestors as well. And remember, a lot of this art was deliberately being made and bought and being passed on through the generations, which is something that we see much less of once art becomes more of a fluid commodity and more of an investment.
Yeah, so part of what you're talking about here, I guess I could tease out as its own category, which is art serving a function, right? I mean, this is religious art. There's at least a big aspect of that. Art that is portraiture, there's an aspect of that, right? It's serving a function that now with portraiture we might just take a photograph, right? But then with the religious art, it's meant to serve a function of a religious purpose, right? Not strictly in a
glorifying God.
But
yeah, so it's glorifying God, and it's also putting in a good word for the donor and also the artist to the higher powers, as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a very good point, because it wasn't just a cynical kind of look what I paid for to put the donor in there. There was also a religious aspect to that it showed devotion, because of course you were parting with with your money in order to do this, and it was all regarded as kind of a tithe, and yes, and proof of devotion. So there were also kind of very, I would say, very mundane sort of value of certain types of art. For instance, the tapestry, which came into prominence, in the sort of late medieval period, were used often as insulation. They were hung over the windows sometimes during the winter to keep drafts out of the of whatever house it was, and so there were also those kind of vulgar sort of utilitarian purposes for certain types of art.
Right, and I was going to say that this feels like a difference again between now and in the past, where it feels very easy for me to think of art serving a function, going back, right? Thinking of older art, tapestries, religious art, family portraits. It's like it's just the examples just go through my mind. Whereas now I'm like, well, when is art serving a function these days? But of course, the thing that leapt to mind is art as political statement, which is really huge right now. I think it's fair to say, right? And your George Floyd mural or whatever, right?
Yes, and of course you also had like civic commissions for particular statues. I mean, David in Florence was commissioned from Michelangelo because David was seen as a symbol of the youthful, small Florentine Republic, and this was and so they wanted a statue to symbolize that. And I mean, yes, and so political art has gone all the way back to sort of the Parthenon, which was constructed as a symbol of sort of the Athenian role in the victory over the Persians and so forth. So it goes back at least as far as that. And then, of course, you've got monarchs who are doing it back in Assyria and Egypt and so forth. Yeah.
Right.
The political dimension, I think, has always been a part of. Yeah, the political dimension has long been a part of it as well. I mean, again, the different sort of tone and mode of of engagement with politics. But yeah, I mean, certainly when Charles the First was having himself painted on horseback, I mean, there was a political implication there. It was also to sort of glorify the strength of that monarch or the current regime or whatever. So yeah, that dimension has been there for a long time as well.
The examples that's coming to mind as you talk, Mr. D, is Napoleon crowning himself. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. Anyway,
yes.
a striking political painting in my view, for multiple reasons. But okay, so did I miss anything? We've got people buying art as social marker, as investment, as a record, and various other functions, religious functions, and so forth. And of course, because they like it, which it's a little hard to figure out how much that factors in with all this other stuff. But I know it's there because I've done it and I've seen people do it. They're like, this is not going to make me richer and it's not going to impress anyone. I just personally want it in my home. I just like it, and it's a little unclear to me at the high prices that real fine art sells for. It's unclear to me how much that factor gets to be there. I mean, I don't know. I assume you guys deal with actually purchasers of art, primary purchasers of art sometimes. Are you able to comment a little bit about sort of what you see?
I mean, I sell art every so often.
Yeah.
So yeah, and obviously and things get sold and bought for different reasons. I think you've covered most of the reasons. We should also, of course, add that there are also donations as well. Have gifts from the artist, especially to a patron. So, for example, I've given drawings to particular collectors who have been quite supportive. So there are also gifts as well.
Right. Okay, so this might feel like a little bit the wrong end to start with, Alexander, but I'm going to go for it. Let's talk about a little bit about what's peculiar about the art market. And then let's back our way into the actual function, because one of the core pieces of knowledge I want us to cover today is just what are the actual components of the art market? Like, who buys, who sells, where do auctions come in, all that sort of stuff, Freeports, I do want to cover all that. But before we do, I want to have our eye on the ball a little bit, that the art market is a little bit strange. So borrowing from your article, Alexander, I guess it's from your book, right? What do we mean by being peculiar about the art market? Well, a great example that you shared is the market for gems. So these are aesthetically pleasing, right? People buy them maybe for all those reasons we listed to some degree, but they are, like art, considered aesthetic objects. But one might say that the art market and the market for gems have some different flavor of character to them. So, Alexander, tell us a few reasons why the fine art market is different than the gem market.
Well, this is because something that Abing notes in his book. He says that there is a certain amount of disgust and self-deceit around money and art, because you talk to a traditionalist, as well as you talk to like a particular conceptualist or like a right-on left-wing artist, and they'll be absolutely disgusted about the talk of money and art going together. But of course, absolutely, money does drive art, and art does drive money. But of course, with art, we deceive ourselves. We say, oh, we fall in love because of something transcendent, something beautiful, and that is true. But it is also connected. But the more transcendent, the more beautiful, the more desirable it is, the more valuable it becomes. And then, of course, we get kind of revolted. We say, oh, I can't stand Picasso. I can't believe they're selling them for 50 million. And it's such a shame that these Van Gogh paintings go for 100 million. When actually, technically, it should have no bearing on how we judge something aesthetically or intellectually. But you talk about a gemstone, no one would say, oh, I'm not going to see that gemstone because it's worth $100 million. No, they want to see it because it's beautiful and because it's famous. So why not do that with paintings as well? So, but is this just this separation, this sort of self-deceit that true art has nothing to do with money? And there are elements that are not connected to money, but art is inevitably connected to money.
And then authenticity is an interesting one. Now, got to be careful here, and I'm hoping you guys can help me tease this out. By the way, it just so happens that I know a little bit about the market for stones and rocks and so forth and gems, because my oldest son has got a big interest in geology. So we actually go to rock shows all the time, which I was assuming would just be sort of the things he is interested in, rough rocks, right? But of course, a rock show has precious gems as well, right? So anyway, I often like talking to the vendors and learning as I'm there, because I'm a econ geek, right? So obviously, authenticity is an issue with, precious metals and precious stones. There are fake diamonds, right? For example. So you've got to prove it's an authentic diamond. Having said that, I don't know that when we talk about authenticity in the world of fine art, it's precisely parallel to the authenticity of a diamond, right?
Oh, well, go ahead. You want to go ahead?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Well, briefly, yes. I'd say there's two types of authenticity when it comes to art. So first is the painting actually by the artist you think it is? And of course, remember that in older times, you had paintings that were made by workshops. So there's obviously a question of like who's hand painted what, and how close is this to the master, and is this a copy? Is this a studio variant, etc., etc. But there's also another element of authenticity, and that is this art come from the real suffering? Has it come from the heart of the artist? Because that makes the passion all the more tangible, and that makes it more valuable as well. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that would be a kind of pernicious, late romantic idea that unfortunately still kind of pervades, feelings about art and authenticity. But certainly the actual authenticity, as Alexander mentioned, whether this piece is by this person and to what degree it's by this person is something that comes up. I mean, just because I've been looking into Warhol so much recently, that is a huge problem with him. Partially because of his working methods, and also because of his kind of casual, certainly in the early part of his career, when the most valuable works were made, a very casual attitude towards, his role in the work and to what degree the works were kind of made and disseminated. I mean, he almost used his work as his own personal currency, in the early part of his career. I mean, he would trade artwork, which now, I mean, again, the works from that period are extraordinarily valuable at the moment. But he would trade them for like dental work and legal, like
Right.
lawyers' fees,
Barter.
and, for like furniture. Like he used them as sort of money. And,
Yeah.
and
This is called barter. This is called barter, Mr. D. We have a term for this.
Yeah, I mean,
barter.
Sort of, but bartering, and
Yeah.
but unfortunately, because of the casualness to which the work was kind of disseminated, it has presented a huge problem as to what what marks an authentic piece of work, and of course,
Right.
when you're playing with millions and sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars, that is a big question. You want to know that you're buying the real thing. So yeah, authenticity is a big problem. The same with gems. I mean, in a different way, but you certainly want to you want to know what you're getting is the real deal, and I think that applies to fine arts as well.
So
I think also, sorry,
of course,
I'd like to
go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, I'd just like to add a little touch of snobbery, because what you get is there's an artist called Giorgio De Curico, very famous metaphysical painter in Italy in the 1910s, and metaphysical paintings from the 1910s are extremely valuable and highly esteemed. Now, later on, De Curico changed his style and was less popular. But then in the 1930s and 40s, he started making replicas of his own paintings. And these were genuine De Chiricos, but he was signing them and dating them with like 1915. So he was kind of forging his own work, but it's still authentically his. But of course, these copies of his own work are considered less authentic, even though they are 100% De Chiricos.
Yeah,
they're less valuable.
Much less valuable. Yeah. So and I'm trying to think of another example of an artist who did that. Well, there was an American artist who you may know, Radley, and Alexander will know, called Gilbert Stuart, who worked in the 18th century and 19th century, and famously did portraits of George Washington. He did and so the original quote portrait that he did of Washington, it was left unfinished, and you most certainly seen copies of that. But then he spent many years producing version after version after version after version of that original sitting that he had with Washington. And so, of course, and the question becomes, well, at which one of these is more valuable? Which one of these is closer to the authentic experience with Washington? They're all Gilbert Stuarts. And so this does come up even with an artist's own work, within their own life.
So I'm particularly interested in what Alexander identified as sort of definition number 2 of authenticity, right? Which is not, which artist did this, but what is the story behind it, right? And this is one of the complaints that I'll hear, the charges I'll hear against some art. People will say, well, why do I have to hear a whole spiel to appreciate it? I mean, if the art's any good, I ought to be able to just see it without a whole narrative around it and about how the artist was, poor and from the streets. And there's all these various markers that are used as authenticity, not just suffering, right? But also that you are from a more, a class of people that is somehow has a more authentic experience of life or something, right?
Yeah, but this relates to the slave master theory of Hegel, that the slave experiences more than the master, so therefore the slave has a more authentic, rounded view of consciousness, and yes, or you could just say it's snobbery.
Yeah, and I would say that is a much more recent phenomenon. This idea of trying to find the authentic kind of artists in the world. I mean, that kind of noble savage thing is something that I think came. I think the big heyday of that was in the 1980s. I'm thinking of someone like Jean-Michel Basquiat, who was very much marketed as the kind of street, from the streets, young black genius graffiti artist, which of course was all a fiction. You know, his background was very different from how he was sort of portrayed. But yes, and it is something that continues to this day. Of course, now there is a great effort to kind of push the work of people from certain demographics as being more kind of valuable or authentic than work by people of other races and demographics. So that kind of, I think, pernicious idea is certainly something that still has currency in the art market. But yeah, and Vincent Van Gogh was another example of this. You know, the torch. Right. In fact, he may be the sort of original tortured artist. Yes.
Right. So when you bring up Basquiat, I can't help but think of the early rap where they're singing about the streets and all that, and it turns out, you know, they grew up in a middle class suburb, you know, but they market themselves.
Oh yeah, and many of those people were also quite connected with the art world. I mean, the sort of rap scene that came out of you know, the late 70s, early 80s in New York was all very intimately connected with kind of a middle class the kind of middle class art downtown art world of that time. So yeah, you're absolutely right about that. But so generally, the idea of authenticity is opposed, I would say.
Right. And I'm struck though, Mr. D, by you talking about. I hadn't thought of this as a theme going into this show, but I feel like we're hitting a little bit of a theme of sort of what has changed between, you know, the world of fine art 500 to 1,000 years ago or something like that, and the world of fine art more recently and more in this century or in the last few centuries. And so I'm struck by your point that I guess we could say that 500 years ago, the king really didn't care if you suffered as a child when he bought your painting or whatever, right? I mean, that just was not a factor in the purchase of art at one time. Is that fair to say?
I think that's absolutely true. The biography of the artist almost had no relevance whatsoever. And you know, in fact, you know, the identity of the artist was sometimes not terribly important.
Right. Yeah. We don't even know who some of the great artists were of a certain period. We know their work, but we don't know who they were. Yes, it's lost to time.
Yeah, they're known by their work. You often see, you know, examples of kind of medieval art. You know, the master of the St. Francis cycle or something like that. The you know, the identity really, you know, the personality of the person who made it wasn't an issue. And I think that's something that again is something that is a fairly modern invention. You know.
Also, I'd add to that. Although the personality wasn't that important, an artist didn't regularly sign work until the Renaissance period, although sometimes you do get the names of makers. There's also the status of the artist. Well, the status of the artist was an artisan until the Renaissance, when the idea of the artist as a thinker started to begin. But you had to be a member of the guild. You could not practice art and sell art unless you were a member of the guild, you had passed an apprenticeship, and you were on the guild's rolls, and you were paying membership to the guild.
Right. So I forget where I was reading about this, but in the English class system, until I think there was a particular artist who really made a push to change this. But if you worked with your hands, that marked you as in a certain lower strata than the highest strata, not necessarily the lowest strata, but just you're not going to be in the highest strata if you work with your hands, right? You're not fit company for the high class dinner, right?
Yes, it's the distinction between the manual arts and the liberal arts, and anyone who worked with their hands was not a practitioner of the liberal arts, and so therefore was of a slightly lower class.
Right, and so the painter, and it's the reason I share this is such a paradigm shift from how we think about painting now, right? Painting has really been glorified, I would say. For example, the painter was someone who worked with his hands. He was a manual artist, an artisan, and so he was not someone you had around tea with your, you know, when you had the king over for supper or something, right?
That's it, and he ran a workshop from his home, and he had apprentices who paid him. They paid a fee to the master while they learned their trade, and it took years for them to learn their trade. Sometimes members of the family were involved. They were involved with cleaning, with making frames, with moving stuff around, with buying props and so forth. They were also involved in the trade of, so for example, selling books or selling prints. The wife would often be involved with the bookkeeping, the selling, and stuff like that. And also she'd be sort of paying the wages to the apprentices and so forth. Yeah, so it was a family enterprise.
Yeah. Although, you know, and of course the status of the artist in society sort of began to rise as the idea of the artist as kind of individual became important. I mean, I think of someone like Peter Paul Rubens, who was you know, who was quite wealthy and very keen to sort of insert himself into the sort of higher society of his day, which he did, and he would entertain and wore quite elegant clothes and had an elegant home and garden and such. So, you know, that is something that came along. But you know, just a few hundred years before that, you had there's a very, very famous book that was written by a late medieval artist called Cennino Cennini, which basically is a kind of one of the first sort of art instruction manuals. It tells you how to grind pigments. It tells you how to, you know, how to paint figures in a certain way. It tells you how to, you know, point brushes and do this. But it also has information on how to, like, varnish cabinets and paint and color in maps and things like that. I mean, so it was very much understood in the early days that if you were a working artist, and this continued up into the 19th century, depending again upon where you were, but if you were a working artist, you weren't just a person who sat and became inspired and painted things in your studio. You were also someone who would be called upon to do all sorts of different tasks, you know, from what we would consider sort of lowly things like, you know, like decorating a cabinet, you know, or putting stencils on walls, to you know, to painting portraits and religious scenes and whatever. So, you know, it was very much understood that the artist was a kind of all-round artisan who could do all sorts of things. I have a book from the 17th century called that's a treatise on sort of painting and drawing, and there's a whole section about doing makeup, doing basically applying ladies' makeup, you know, because that's something that you could potentially do as you had training as a painter. You could possibly do that as a way to, you know, earn money. So, you know, it was a very expansive definition.
This is another reason
what it meant to be an artist.
Right. This is another reason I find Warhol interesting, because most people would know about him as a fine artist and not know that throughout that whole time, if I understand correctly, Mr. D, he worked as I don't know what to call it, an industrial artist, right? He had a regular job, and then he also did
I mean, he
the
spent,
fine art.
He spent 10. He spent 10 years. I mean, not doing fine art at all. I mean, he spent 10 years as a commercial illustrator and, you know, sort of graphic designer, ad man, before he ventured into fine art at all. And then, of course, you could say that throughout his career, he also was very happy to dabble in very commercial kind of projects, which is something that many artists do. I mean, I don't think people should get the impression that he was the only one. I mean, I think that there's always been this you know, fluidity between categories, and in a sense, even being a fine artist is being a commercial artist, because you know, presumably you are producing something that you're producing a commodity that is sold, so you are engaging in commerce.
I'm glad for us to cover all this, because I wanted to break down. I'm assuming some people are new to all this, and I wanted to break down that sort of simplistic picture that a lot of people, I think, get if they don't really know much about artists or the real artist art market, which is, like you said, John D., somebody sits around waiting for some passionate burst of creativity, creates some amazing work of inspiration, and then you know, is poor or strikes it rich and becomes famous, right? But the fact that you know, there's many artists who would do a spectrum of things, a spectrum that we've made up more recently, right? Where there's sort of the high art on one end and sort of the low you know, he did an album cover or something. I don't know, you know, illustration, graphic design type of art on the other end. Anyway, Mr. Adams, you're going to say.
Yeah, I would also like to muddy the waters by talking about the low end of the art market. So, for
Yeah.
example, where do we draw the line between professional and amateur artists? I think this is one of the problems with Abing's book that I reviewed, is that he's not quite clear about where the definition is, how he's going to define professional versus amateur. So, for example, I'll give you an example. Many artists, they go and do a degree, so they do like 3 years, 4 years. You don't have to, but you can. So then you're qualified. Now, of course, you don't need to be qualified to sell a painting or to exhibit. There's no barrier in the way that there used to be when you're a member of a guild or a society. So anyone can exhibit art, anyone can sell art. But say, for example, you're a professional artist, so you've got a qualification, you've got a studio, you have 3, 4 years, you have 4 years of exhibiting, selling art, and you're making money from it, and you're actually, amazingly, you're making a living from it. Now, art fluctuates, income fluctuates very much. So what happens when he comes to the 5th year and he has no exhibitions, he has no commissions, he makes no sales at all? Is he a professional artist, an amateur artist, or is he a professional artist who is economically not active? Because he's not lost his status, he's just simply lost his income. So what is he for that year?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
I wanted to go somewhere.
A complicated thing. Oh, sorry. One thing to add. So you don't have a status that can be withdrawn. You don't have like a license to practice, like a doctor or a lawyer. So that can't be withdrawn. You can't lose your qualification. It can't be removed from you. You still have your skills, but you're not economically active. So what is your status?
An artist cannot be disbarred, right? In fact, I don't even know why exactly you would do such a thing, if you even could, you know. Like what activity would cause an artist to be disbarred? You know,
Immoral activity, I should imagine.
I guess, I don't know. Okay, so let us, again, continue to back our way into the crass dollars and cents aspect of this. I want to play off something we were just talking about, which is the identity of the artist becoming more significant, right? One of the things you talk about in your article, which I think, did I finally share it? I meant to.
Yes,
I'll do it again.
It in the chat,
anyway,
so people can find that.
Okay, good. Yes, I did share the link in the live chat. I recommend it to everybody. It's not a long read. You talk about the almost black and white nature of economic gains for artists. And I don't think you have the chart in the article, but you paint it movingly, right? Which is, if you paint do a bar chart or whatever of artists sorted by how much money they make, you have a long, flat x-axis, a line along the x-axis, which is artists who are basically making nothing, essentially nothing, right? And then you go up a little bit, and some people who are sort of maybe making enough to have a living at it, right? They're not celebrities, but they this is their job, and they're able to do it full time, and they're able to support themselves with it. That is a small select group, I think it's fair to say. Out of all the artists in the world, that is itself quite a small group. Then you go to the really, even within that small group, a much tinier percentage of artists who are a name you would recognize, right? And they are making way more money than any of the rest, right? So it doesn't gradually go up. Don't think like bell curve type behavior. It's more like a swoop up at the end or something, right, Alexander?
Yeah, so this is something very common. This is called like the winner takes all in economics. Right. So you've got certain people right at the very top who are getting millions and millions. They are multi-millionaires, but there's very few of them. And so you go down, and it's relatively rare to find an artist who can make a full-time living and put away savings and pay for their family and so forth. So yeah, this is something that is unusual about the economy. Also, you have a massive oversupply of artists. You have so many people going and getting qualifications in art. Now, they're not always using those to become an artist. They may become a teacher or an art dealer, or they want to start a gallery, or they want to go into publishing, or they want to go into sort of art teaching or something. So they're not necessarily going to become artists. But there's a massive oversupply of artists, which has been encouraged by universities and been encouraged by government. And this is what means you've got so many artists who want to be professional artists. They're not just sort of people who enjoy doing it as a hobby. They want to be professional artists, but cannot make any income really at all. And that's why you have such a weird, distorted graph.
So here's where I'm driving with this. And I know I doubt we have the data, right? But just at a guess, know your knowledge of art history and so forth. My guess is that the shape of that graph 500 years ago or 600 years ago or something like that is very different. You don't have that high end, the celebrity, and you probably don't have the long flat line either, right?
Yeah, this is it. I mean, because if you weren't making money as an artist, you were doing something else. Because the thing is that you had to put a certain amount of time in, effort in. You had to do your apprenticeship. You had to pay your guild roll, and then you're like a baker, or you're like a doctor, or a brewer. That you have your once you get in at that level, you're only working to commission, or people are buying from your shop, but mainly it's to commission. So basically, there is no demand, and there is no survivability for an artist who cannot sell work. So there is a much smaller supply, much more restricted. There are restrictions on who can go in and who can actually operate. And there is virtually no public subsidy. There is kind of a subsidy coming from the princes and the monarchs and the church and stuff, but that's for specific works, and that's not a general thing.
Right, and then the high end. Let's talk about the high end. Now, Mr. D brought up an example of someone who seemed to live pretty well back then as an artist. But I'm guessing, tell me if you know better, Mr. D, I'm guessing that this was not, you wouldn't even have 10. Like you were in your article, Alexander, you talked about there's maybe 10 names that like people would know, right? I'm suspecting 700 years ago or whatever, you wouldn't have even had 10 artists who would have been like celebrity. Well, they wouldn't have been celebrities, but living large off their art. Let's put it that way. Mr. D?
Well, it tended to be much more local, so of course it would be who is the big name in Florence, who was the big name in in Venice. I mean, we didn't we didn't have the sort of worldwide scope in general, but yeah, I mean, I think it may have been it may be kind of consistent over the years. I mean, there wouldn't have been many, but yes, certainly there were artists who were, I think once you get past the Renaissance, you're going to get, I mean, people like Titian, who was extraordinarily wealthy and very well known by the end of his life, and Peter Paul Rubens, who I mentioned, and Leonardo da Vinci, who was given, was almost treated as a sage at the end of his life. I mean, he was presented with a castle by Francis I of France, and spent his last few years living in France at the behest of the king. So so yes, there were certainly people who did quite well and lived quite comfortably. But yeah, it was a very small group of people among in any one place, and you sort of built up to like the 17th century in the Low Countries in Holland and such, where there were hundreds, thousands of artists. I mean, strangely enough, there was a similar kind of almost sort of similar glut of artists to successful artists at the time, and most of them are forgotten. Most of them didn't really make it, but yes, there were of course big names even back then. It just tended to be a slightly more local phenomenon. But yeah, very small group of people, I think at any time in history.
Right. So okay. So that picturing that graph then, now as opposed to in the past, it sounds like the biggest thing we should picture is that the long flat portion is just chopped off. You don't have a bunch of people who are starving artist. It's just not a thing.
They're not in the
really.
market.
No, no.
Yeah, yeah, and then the highs at the high end, maybe there are still some artists doing fairly well, but I'm suspecting the highs are way higher as we get closer to our own time.
Yeah, because you're harnessing global capital as opposed to just regional capital. So
Right.
yeah, Titian became
Right.
and Rubens became very rich and very well known. And they were one of these rarities in that they were actually being commissioned from other city states. Most artists just worked in the place where they lived, and that was it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, it would take some, a sort of economist to kind of figure out the relative scale of the wealth of an
Yeah.
artist
Right.
from that time, and you would have to know. I mean, again, not to keep going back to Warhol, but he's very, very forward in my mind because I've did sort of research for the stream. But
Yeah.
after he died, his estate was valued by the courts at being worth $500 million. So I mean, how did that compare on the scale of wealth to someone like Rubens or Titian at the time? I don't know. I mean, and of course it's very, very difficult to kind of calculate a fiat currency with,
Right. Yeah.
the
Inflation
modern
adjusts.
day
Yeah.
with the past. But yes, but I suspect those, those people. But yes, there were a few breakout people who had, as Alexander said, had fame beyond their local area. I mean, Leonardo, of course, again invited by a king of a different country to come live there. So there were a few that had great international fame.
Okay, so let's get into some mechanics. First of all, I didn't even know this term. I heard it from Mr. D. Primary versus secondary markets. What does that mean, Mr. D?
Well, I mean, it's the sense that, so basically when you create a work, you're going to either sell it yourself, you're going to sell it to a patron or someone who's commissioned it, or someone who collects your art, or you're going to be represented by a gallery, which is sort of
Right.
like a business which sells artwork. They represent artists. And so my sort of understanding of this is that the artist is from the studio to the kind of into the market, from the artist's workshop into either a collector's home or into the gallery and then into a collector's home. I mean, that would be the kind of primary market, and then the secondary markets would be that person who collected your art then sells it. They either sell it to another party, they sell it through an auction house, sell it through another gallery. They can sell it back to your same gallery, who will then sell it on again to someone else. And so, of course, you have this market, which, depending upon where you're talking about, doesn't involve the artist in the transaction.
Right.
Although there are exceptions to that, because in certain places there are rules which kind of give the artist some stake in some secondary transactions.
I think it's
I'd not heard of such a thing.
Yeah,
basically it's a royalty.
Yeah, royalties basically. I can't really. Yeah, I can't remember. It's a French word that's used, and you'll see that certainly if you go to the big Phillips, Sotheby's, Christie's, you will see that term, because in some jurisdictions the artist will receive a part of that. So so of course this is going to make a very big difference, certainly in the modern day. I mean, back to Warhol again. I mean, his prices were never very high. I mean, he did very well, and of course he was very well known, but his prices compared to some of his contemporaries were not that great during his lifetime. I think that probably six figures was I don't know that he ever surpassed $1 million during his lifetime. He may have.
For a single work. You're talking about prices for a single work.
For a single work, or take someone like Jasper Johns, who's a living artist, but also I would say very, very, very well known. He may have sold a painting in the 1950s for like $1,000.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when you look at some of those works, certainly from that period, these are things that are being regularly sold for 10, 20, 50, $100 million. And of
Yeah, right.
course, for the most part, he doesn't have any stake in that. So something he
Right.
sold for $1,000 in 1959 is he can watch be sold for $100 million in 2020, or 2021. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so there is a big distinction there between what you sort of earn initially, and then of course what the work can be worth as it trades and as it moves through the market over time.
Okay, so we'll talk more about this later, but correct me if I'm wrong. The auction, I think, is purely a secondary market phenomenon. You wouldn't have a primary sale at an auction, would you?
Not entirely correctly. It wasn't until very recently.
Ah,
There are
okay.
occasionally artists who give the work to the auction house to sell. That's relatively rare. Until Damien Hirst did it
Oh,
in a big sale in 2008 or 2009, just around the time of the crash.
oh wow.
And this was considered very controversial because what it did is it
Yeah.
bypassed the primary market. It
Mm-hmm.
avoided his dealers and his galleries and all the
Mm-hmm.
people who had a natural interest in selling his art first time around. And he sold, I think it was through, I can't remember, it's Christie's or Sotheby's, but he put up about £100 million worth of art and was selling it directly through an auction. And it
Yeah.
was a partial success, but it's a very, very risky thing because if you fail
Mhm.
big and it's public and everyone can see, and your prices drop. So it's it's a high gamble.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
uh-huh.
so
Yeah, so
and
go
another
ahead.
thing I should mention about this primary market is that of course there has been a shift slightly away from the gallery representation of an artist, to kind of direct sales. And certainly, what tends to happen when an artist gets to a certain point in their career where they're very well known, they're making a lot of money, they will often try to kind of strike out on their own, and they will try to make their own sales
Yeah.
to patrons outside of the gallery, because of course you have to remember that the gallery takes a massive commission to
Yeah,
sell work.
right,
I am talking on the order of 50%.
Yeah,
Right.
So
that's standard.
which is standard. So when you
yeah.
sell a painting, so if I make a painting that's £20,000 on the market, for the person buying it, I get half of that if I sell through a
Mm-hmm.
gallery.
Wow.
So the commission is huge. So I think there have been attempts with, of course, different ways of selling and funding and marketing and financing things, opening up with electronic, finance being much more diverse, that to kind of get away from the gallery market. But it depends, of course, because then you get into a level where you're dealing with tens of millions of dollars, and of course you need someone to sort of broker that. So
Mm-hmm.
you go to some like Larry Gagosian to kind of broker some deal between a hedge fund manager who wants to buy one of your works that you've had stored away, and so that there's complexities there. But yes, the primary market has its own vast negatives depending upon which area you choose to sell your work through.
What's coming to mind when you talk about trying to, outgrow the gallery system or whatever, strike out on your own? I'm thinking of like the Beatles starting the Apple label. I don't know if anyone remembers this except me.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah.
was a baby, right? But I know about it well because my favorite James Taylor album was released on the Apple label and has a big apple in the middle of the vinyl. And so I'm always got that apple in my head. It's a green apple. Anyway, yeah. So same kind of idea. You get to a point where you're like, why are all these middlemen taking a slice? People know about me. I ought to be able to just go right to the people who want my stuff and cut out the middlemen, right? And then I guess the example you gave with Damien Hirst, he sort of went even more radical in a way, and went right to what we would think of as a secondary market mechanism, and did primary art sales
Yeah.
through it. in a way, turning the auction house into a gallery or a dealer, economically speaking, right? They suddenly the auction house was taking on a different role than it had had when he did that. That's interesting that you share this, because I was thinking we'd be talking about things that were, obviously some things that are sort of 20th century phenomena. I didn't think we'd be talking about something that is 21st century phenomena. You're saying that no one had done this before 12 years ago or whatever, right?
Yeah, on that scale, I think, people had consigned, like you have, big artists like Jasper Johns or something, or Robert Rauschenberg. They've got a painting that they've had in storage for 30, 40 years, and they might decide, oh, okay, well, I'll take it to auction. But yeah, the Damien Hirst one was very public, and it was seen as a great risk, and he's not done it since.
Yeah, and you also, if you look
Okay.
at these auction houses, you will see that they are also really starting to kind of brand themselves as kind of cultural institutions. So they have many more kind of, so they have what they're calling selling exhibitions now. So basically they mount kind of quasi scholarly exhibitions of work, which are also happen to be for sale. They have kind of educational programs. They have you can I noticed that Christie's is now flogging art courses, so you can basically buy an online course in in art appreciation and in sort of collecting and all these things. So they are starting to kind of brand themselves as cultural institutions, and that may be perhaps something in a way, in a move towards this thing, like the Damien Hirst model, where an artist is just going to start working for Christie's and selling their work directly through these auction houses. So they may be sort of trying to expand their kind of market in a way that they didn't before, and they operate very differently now than they did even 30 years ago, 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Okay, so we have ended up on auctions. That's fine. I have a note in here about auction manipulation. I'm hoping that one of you two can expound on this. I don't even know why I have the note.
Okay, well, I'll give you an example. So this is underbidding. So, for example, a work by an artist comes up, their gallery decides, okay, this is kind of a tasty work. We think we can place this with a buyer. So what we're going to do is we're going to buy it from the auction house and we're going to resell it. So they might go and buy it like that. Or they might, and what they might do is they might get someone to underbid them. So every time I bid like 500,000, you go up 500,000, then I go up 500,000. And that way we can work our way up. So this work that's valued at $10 million goes up to $20 million. It sells at $20 million. And then suddenly all of the artist's work suddenly increases in value. And who benefits from that? Well, it's the primary dealer, because they say, oh, we'd love to sell you this painting that we've got here in the gallery for, at 8 million. But, did you see that big auction price? His work's very valuable now. Unfortunately, we've had to put it up to 15 million. And it's that is manipulation, because it's not a true reflection of the value.
Yeah, and or you have kind of private sales. So there is this sort of stratospheric level where you have someone like Stefan Edlis, who is a huge collector of art, and he is some sort of I don't know what his business is. He may be a hedge fund manager, I don't know. Or take someone like Stephen Cohen, who became I think slightly well known during the GameStop trading debacle, if you remember that, either of you.
Yeah.
So these men are kind of huge collectors of art, but art at a very, very high level. So say one of them will have, I don't know, a painting by Jasper Johns, and I can't remember the players involved, but there is a Jasper Johns painting called False Start that was painted in the 1950s, and it was, I believe, owned by David Geffen of Geffen Records, and sold by him directly to another collector for some absolutely massive amount of money. We're talking about, $100 million. Right. And this happens with some regularity on this level. So what that will do, as Alexander said, is it will immediately, kind of word of this transfer gets out, and it will immediately push prices, you know, up and up and up, because you suddenly have an example where you can say, well, this artist's work is being traded on this level. And of course, these men will have many, many different works in their collection, and so at a certain level, that you can kind of really manipulate the market if you're a big player in the market. In the case of Warhol, that has been a long concern, because his estate, the Andy Warhol, the Warhol Estate, the Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, the Warhol Authentication Board. I mean, these kind of organizations that were kind of centered around the estate were very much involved in the market of selling the huge amount of works that were left in the artist's estate when he died. And so, of course, they can have a great effect upon the price of these works at auction. And so and in the 30 years or so since Warhol died, his work has become massively valuable. And I don't want to make the accusation that there is manipulation going on, but it certainly has an effect, because they're very litigious, so one has to be very careful. But it's certainly, you can have a great effect upon the prices of an artist's work by strategic sales in these markets. So yes.
Yeah. See, I was thinking, Mr. D, that you tried to stay anonymous to protect yourself from left-wing crazies or whatever. In fact, it's so that you can talk about art dealers and not have them sue you, right?
Oh God, if I could share some of the sleaze that I have seen over my life.
Well, here's what I'm hearing, just thinking about comparing to different markets that we think about economically, right? One is where you have a lot of sort of a large quantity of relatively undifferentiated examples of a product, right? So you think about, gas and buying gas and the gas market and the market for corn and things like this, right? Compared to that, the art market, especially at the higher levels, right? The number of things that are of interest to the collector are not that big, right? I mean, there's plenty, right? But it's not in the millions of units, right? I mean, it's in the hundreds or thousands.
And they're not standardized
right?
units.
Yeah.
Right, and they're not standardized. They're not just interchangeable, right? And then the number of people purchasing them. When we think about these other kinds of commodity markets, everybody needs gas, everybody needs corn. Well, there's not everybody buys art, and certainly not everybody buys art that is over $1,000 or $10,000 a piece, right? That just even that low. I know that that's a joke number to you guys, right? But for most mere mortals, a piece of art that costs over $1,000 is something they're just never going to think to buy, right? So you immediately, once you hit that price point, you immediately get down to a relatively small number of buyers. And so my point in bringing all that up is things like manipulating the market is much more realizable when you've got a relatively small number of buyers, relatively small number of products that are not the same, right? It's much harder to do what OPEC was trying to do or something like that, right? There you're dealing with massive market forces up against you, a lot of people interested in undercutting you. Here you start playing games at an auction and there's not a lot of players involved. There's not millions of people involved, right? There's a few hundred or something. And at the highest levels, maybe even less than that. When you talk about $100 million piece of art, there's only a small number of people in the world who are going to be able to think about something like that, right? So I'm just pointing all this out to say that the art market is peculiar in other ways besides what we started with, right? The fact that you have this authenticity aspect and so forth. It's also that it's sort of small in a way. I don't mean in the dollar amounts. It's big in the dollar amounts, right? But it's sort of small in terms of the products being offered for sale, the people who are making the purchases. It's a relatively small number of individuals, institutions, and so forth that even play in this market at all. many parts of the world and the economy have nothing to do with the art market. They don't spend a dime on it, right?
No, I
Yeah.
just want to clarify something quick, Bradley. Is that I don't want to imply that David Geffen and Stephen Cohen trading $100 million Jasper Johns is the art market. I mean, there are many art
Yeah.
markets, and
Right,
so of
right, right,
course,
right.
you're going to get people that are dealing, that are selling and dealing in 19th century landscape. You're going to get people who are
Yeah.
dealing exclusively in Picasso prints, and that's something we haven't mentioned, but there is a whole kind of flourishing world of prints, which are an aspect of artists' work, but they tend to be a much more approachable. You can buy a Picasso or a Warhol for much less if you go into the print market, or Picasso ceramics, which were produced as editions by a
So,
commercial pottery.
I'm sorry, real quick on
there,
prints. On prints, Mr. D, are you talking about like limited edition prints or just something anybody
yes,
can go and?
so
Okay.
No, a limited edition print. Yes. So
Okay.
of course,
Okay.
yes, there is a whole aspect of art production, which again is very old. I mean, Rembrandt's, was doing it and was a big aspect of his work. But basically, producing, a multiple. You do an etching,
Yeah.
you do an engraving, you do a lithograph, you do,
Right.
a silk screen, or which is politely called a serigraph, if you want to if you want to make it sound more romantic. But yes, and so artists will produce a limited edition print, and so these will be
Right.
printed by generally a master printer. The artist will create the kind of the original, whether it be plates or whatever, the drawing on the stone,
Okay.
and then they will make a specified number of these. And so they're original works, but they're not original in the same way that the artist sat and painted them by hand.
Oh,
And so
they're also numbered as well.
and they're numbered,
So
yes.
that
And
shows
so
you that they're limited.
Right.
very strictly generally. So you will have out of an edition of 250 or out of an edition of 1,000, whatever. And then of course this is another way to have art that is much less expensive and allows a much wider kind of market for people who can't afford the
And,
the paintings on canvas.
and I have to say,
so,
I have to say, Mr. D, I had thought of the prints as how do I put it? Sort of a trick or something. But as you describe it, it sounds like, at least in some cases, I mean, you could have shoddy prints. I'm sure it's been done. That somebody does some limited edition, everyone's like, this is a joke. This is just not well done. The materials and so forth are not well done. But it sounds like you're saying that for many artists, they would take real care with the production of a print. It wouldn't maybe be on the same level as the original work or whatever, or an original painting or something. But it isn't like just using a photocopier or something. I mean, they're really thinking about the paper, the materials. This is meant to last.
Oh yeah,
right. Yeah.
These are original works. I mean, generally, when an artist does a print, they're not just making a reproduction of one of their paintings. I mean, the print is art in itself. I mean, you take an artist like Jasper Johns, who we mentioned. Of course, a huge part of his output has been making prints, but then they're not just copies of the paintings. They're artworks in their own right. It's just that they're done in multiples, so there's sort of more than one of them. So but there are of course sleazy things that happen in this market as well. I saw someone long ago in the chat mention Salvador Dali, who at the end of his life was
this is something that I will be discussing on the next Ferro stream. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. They've been doing some wonderful streams about Dali on Ferro's channel. But yes, I mean, Dali was basically signing blank pieces of paper, and when you do that, you can print whatever you want on them and sell them at any time. And so of course there's sleaze. There's sleaze that goes on at this end of the market as well. But the larger point is I wanted to point out that there isn't just one art world. There are many art worlds. There's many art markets, and they all have their own kind of rules and logic and stars and price points.
Right, and so there'd be people who would be experts on 19th century landscape or something, and that's like what they know. Right, and that's the market they know and the artists they know, and it's people we wouldn't have heard of.
They collect that. Yeah, and they collect that. The people who there are galleries who will deal in like one artist, or a few different artists or one style. So Yeah, I mean there are more players in these various art markets than you would imagine. I
Okay.
mean,
Well,
if you go to another country, there's many artists that I've never even heard of. They will have
mhm.
their own local. So there are all still local markets as well.
Local scenes. Yeah, yeah. Let's introduce a couple last pieces to the puzzle, and maybe you guys will introduce some that I didn't know about. So this whole issue of art as investment brings in some other aspects of this, right? There's tax havens of various sorts. The Freeport is what I've heard it called, for example, which blew my mind when I learned about it. It is literally usually in some place like Switzerland that has a history of sort of tax haven type status. Someplace like Switzerland, it is just a warehouse, and literally people will buy a work of art not to display it. That's the part that blew my mind. I'm still naive, right? I'm still picturing the person like, well, yeah, it's a social marker. Maybe I don't care that much about it, but I want people to see that I have it, right? Well, as far as I can tell, with a Freeport, you buy it and you stick it in cold storage, basically. I mean, I call it cold storage, but with the right humidity and blah blah blah, so it'll be preserved. And you're literally just trying to preserve its investment
Yeah.
value, and it serves
This.
no purpose, as far as I know, of social marker or aesthetic pleasure. It is a thing with a dollar amount on it that you have parked in a bank, in an art bank, an art vault,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So this is essentially, it's an art vault. You're right. This is very common in places like Switzerland, for example. I know that Singapore has also done this, and I should imagine that you're getting this across certain places in the Middle East, where
Right.
basically you have a climate controlled warehouse, top security, top fire protection,
Yeah. Yeah.
and basically you can move things in and out. And and I think it's basically, as long as there isn't like a national order that this is a national treasure and cannot be removed, there's basically no limit into what you can put in there and take out. So this is a place where investors put pictures. This is where dealers put pictures, because dealers often have stocks of hundreds or thousands of pictures that they don't want obviously on their premises, but they have to have somewhere safe to store them. These are places that are being sort of negotiated for. These are pictures that are at the center of disputes between different parties as to who owns it. This is also where you will find the last remnants of the art that was stolen during World War II. And there are various art dealers, especially German art dealers, that they used to be based in Munich, and they would park stuff just over the border in Switzerland. And also I should mention that also the art is known as the largest grey market in the world, because there is a lot of ambiguity about the legality of certain things, of who owns a picture, how much a picture is worth, who's paying tax on that, who's avoiding tax, who's appraising the value, and do they have a stake in appraising high or appraising low. So it's an extremely complex, a very interesting and slightly dodgy market.
Yes.
Right. Speaking of the
And
dodginess, go ahead.
You will see. So if you go and look at auction records, you will see, if you look at the provenance of many of these pieces, you will see that in the past, I would say 10 years or so, there's a much greater frequency of people flipping. So they do the same thing that they in some level they do with the real estate market. They will buy
Right.
these pieces, they will put them in they will store them, and then they will wait a few years, and then they will put them back in the auction. So you will see it was sold at Christie's in 2013 for so X dollars, and then of course the next provenance entry, it was sold in 2017 for so many dollars. Now it's up again at auction. So you have people basically buying and selling these like stocks, and holding them and flipping them, and they do this at these places where they can store them advantageously to avoid
And also
avoid tax.
flipping can also reduce the price, because if it's something that's been sold a lot, it can look as though people are doing that, and it reduces the price. Also, you have things that are burned, so you offer it on the market and you offer it for 10 million and you can't sell it, and then you're offering it later. People know you're offering it for less than 10 million because you couldn't sell it properly the first time around, and so a work of art becomes burned, as it were.
Yeah. And occasionally literally burned. I mean, there was, of course, a famous story where a warehouse, which contains a large bit of the Saatchi collection, including Tracy Emin's famous tent that contained the names of everyone she'd shagged, went up in flames, and the circumstances of that I don't know about, but so yeah, there are lots of strange things that happen, but generally these places are, as Alexander said, very secure, and there are many artworks that are there locked away that will not see the light of day for a very long time.
Yeah, I was going to say,
you're right. There are things being bought and stored without any regard for their beauty.
Right, yeah, that's sort of the shocking part to me. But then also, when you talk about it being dodgy, or if you want to take another view of it, the ability of people to move value around without the government being so involved, which could be viewed as a positive, right? I mean, I'm just picturing that there must be times where literally a work of art just moves from one vault to another, if you follow me.
Yeah.
Right?
Or not even,
Well, not even. They just changed the title is changed. They just changed.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. I'm picturing that I don't know. I'm picturing the Harry Potter vault where you've got your stuff in a vault, and maybe that's not how it works. Maybe it's more that you just say, okay, this piece of art is in this spot right here, and now somebody else owns the deed to it or whatever, right? But yeah, basically a way to move value around, because that's the thing they're always doing in the financial markets, is trying to control the ability of people to move large sums of money or value without the government being able to snoop on it, right? And this seems like, wow, this is a pretty nice little loophole, right? I just say, hey, buddy, I've got something that's worth $1 million in a vault over here. It's now yours. And there could be like almost no paperwork, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also you've got things like bundling, where you have 3 pictures and you sell them for $10 million. And of course, how do you value each picture? Because who knows what proportion of that 10 million that particular painting was worth. So how are you going to tax that?
Right.
How are you going to appraise it and so forth? And that's why it's a grey market.
Yeah.
This is where
Brandon, can I
yeah.
I just wondered if I could share just briefly one of my favorite anecdotes about this thing to do with tax and valuation and things like that. So there was an artwork that it was produced in 1959 by Robert Rauschenberg called Canyon, and it is one of his sort of combine pictures. So it's basically a kind of collage of including paint and sort of found objects and materials. And part of this combine artwork, there is a stuffed golden eagle. So a taxidermied golden eagle, which he bought from a junk shop or something. I mean, it was very old when he made this picture. It's like a 19th century, piece of taxidermy. So it's attached to this painting. It's part of the painting.
Right.
This painting was owned by a gallerist called Ileana Sonnabend, who was very well known in the art world. She was actually once married to another famous dealer called Leo Castelli, and she had this work in her collection until her death. It was her, I think she said it was her favorite work by Rauschenberg. Well, of course, she died, and her estate is enormously valuable. We're talking lots and lots of money and lots of artwork. So I'm just going to read this from the Wikipedia. Sonnabend's heirs had little choice but to donate the piece after the IRS established the piece's value at $65 million and charged the Sonnabends $29.2 million in taxes to keep it. However, due to the fact that there was a golden eagle attached to the canvas, and because of the 1940 Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act and the 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the work the work could not be sold because the sale of the painting would have been a felony because there was a golden eagle attached to it.
Yeah.
So
Yep, that's right.
what they had to do is the estate's appraisers placed a value of $0 on the painting, and due to these complications, the heirs decided to donate the work to the Museum of Modern Art. So literally, this
so you couldn't sell it. You couldn't sell it, but you could donate it.
You couldn't
sell it. You could sell it, but they could only donate it because they put a value of $0 on it. So basically, it had to be deemed worthless so that they could give it away. And this is a painting that on the open market would have, I mean, it was valued at $65 million by the IRS. It may have, if it had it been sold, it may have been worth significantly more than that. Yeah, that also that line about basically that if they wanted to keep the picture, they had to pay $30 million in taxes to the IRS. So you can see that there's some very complicated things that go on. But that's always been one of my favorite little stories about an artwork. So
hey, you brought something up that I'm surprised I didn't have in my notes. How do museums fit into the art market? Now, they purchase art. They are buyers of art, right? They don't only receive donations. Yep. Is that correct?
Well, yes. I think the problem is that most art museums are kind of priced out, basically. A lot of art museums, especially if they're buying older art, then it's basically someone in the country dies and they have to pay a massive inheritance duty on the picture because they want to sell it, but they can't sell it abroad. So it's classed as a national treasure. So you can only sell it basically to someone within the state. And so you kind of fudge it and you low estimate it and you sell it to the state for, 3 or 4 million. But when you're talking about really, really expensive pictures, museums are kind of completely classed out. But you can give, in some countries, you can give paintings to museums if it's of a certain high quality, high enough standard. And that is classed as either tax deductible or payment of inheritance tax or whatever. So you get millionaires donating very expensive paintings to museums because it reduces their tax burden.
Yeah.
Tax avoidance. Yeah, and I just noticed something in a museum recently that I had not observed before, which is that there was the name of someone who they hadn't donated it. It somehow, they still owned it, but it was like being displayed by the, do you understand this? I was like, what? I didn't even understand what the arrangement meant.
Or promised to give, or promised to gift of.
Promised to give or something, yeah.
That is very common, mostly because, of course, if you own a very valuable work of art, it's it's very expensive to keep it because, of course, you have to deal with the security of the piece of work. You have to deal with the conservation of the piece of work. You have to deal with, the stability, all of these things. I mean, it's great risk. Yeah, I mean, if you've got a Goya, that's a responsibility. So it's often easier for certain collectors to just basically give it to a museum to keep, and so the museum, of course, has to incur all these things, and then and in some cases, as Alexander mentioned, you could get a tax deduction, certainly if you're going to give it to the museum at the end of that. But that's very, very common. You will often see that in museums, and they certainly rely on that. But museums do occasionally buy things on the open market. They will occasionally buy things from galleries, and another famous case I can remember is the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York buying a painting by Duccio de Buoninsegna for, I think, $45 million from a collector.
Wow!
So, which had been substantially tarted up, I believe. Yeah, the restoration was rather extensive.
Yeah, and that of course, there's a whole controversy related to that, but so museums do occasionally buy things, but mostly they are not. They will be. They're not in the league of people who can afford these really big ticket works. So they do rely on donations and such. But there are advantages, and there are reasons why people would donate other than just altruism.
Think of the museums not as big players in terms of just out there bidding something up at an auction. That's probably not
generally not
a typical role. But think of them as a tax loophole where art sort of falls into the museum for tax
Yeah.
reasons. And it
No,
sounds like it would be a social marker, right? I mean, I would assume
Yeah.
that in addition to the other benefits Mr. D outlined, your name's there in the museum next to this
Yeah.
big work of art, and people are seeing it. I mean, that's people got to think that's pretty cool, right?
you get your name there. There's another small aspect of this is where museums will occasionally get rid of things, so they will deaccession pieces from their collection and sell them, or they will trade them to a collector. So say you have your Duccio, and so the museum really wants it, they will give you things from their collection in exchange for it. So there are these things. So the gong, people that ever watch Unpopular Opinions may know about the gong that I hit
Yeah.
during the show. That gong was deaccessioned from a museum collection, and I bought it at an auction. So, I mean, cheap. So they do get rid of things that are surplus to their requirements, or that they have duplicates. Or they don't need it. It's not something important.
Yeah.
So,
or what they say is it's sort of extraneous to the main core of the collection. So we tend to exhibit sort of 20th century paintings, and some donor left us an Egyptian scarab, jeweled scarab. So it doesn't really fit with the rest of the collection. So can we get permission to sell it or transfer it to another museum? And the answer is usually yes, but it tends to be quite a long-winded thing, and there are lots of politics involved in deaccessioning.
Yes, and I don't want to get into it, but there's also, of course, a new thing called decolonizing the collection.
Yes.
Which, again, like everything else, there are ulterior motives to that. So that's
tell us one. Tell us an ulterior.
Well,
motive.
I'll
Give
tell
us
you
an
one
example.
famous example. I'll tell you one famous example. I believe it was either the Baltimore or Detroit Museum of Art.
Baltimore.
Had a few works, including a Bryce Marden and an Andy Warhol Last Supper painting, which they declared that they were going to sell basically in the service of decolonizing the collection, and so that they could use the proceeds from selling these works to buy works by more diverse artists.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it also happens that those works that they were decolonizing were worth a hell of a lot of money on the in the auction market at the time they were doing it, and so of course.
Yeah.
What was the motivation there? I mean, eventually that sale was actually blocked. They were not allowed to get rid of those works from the collection. There was
by their governing body or something, or who blocked
yes,
by the board of trustees or something.
The board of trustees, people resigned. I mean, there was a huge furore over it, and so occasionally evil doesn't win, but there's always going to be. You always have to look to the financial motivations of these things, because nothing is happening at these levels because of altruism or because of noble social causes.
Right. So I don't think we need to go on about it, but I realized that we hadn't really focused on galleries. Unless you guys are going to tell me something I didn't know, it would be reasonable, economically speaking, to think of galleries as essentially a marketing vehicle for art. Is that fair to say? It is also
a
way for buyers and sellers to be brought, a way for buyers and sellers to come together. Right. It's just because it's too hard. It's as usual with a marketing mechanism like this, it's meant to be a bit of a filter. The idea is, hey, this is a gallery with some kind of reputation, I suppose. And so if I go there, it's gonna be worth my time. They're going to have done some pre-filtering for me, as opposed to wandering through, massive warehouses of art going, there's just nothing here my wife is a big, what do you call it? Thrifting. I don't know if you call it this in the UK. Secondhand.
Oh, yeah.
That sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah. So, I've many times been rifling through, useless paintings that just end up, you can buy it for $5 or something, and every so often someone finds one that turns out to have been by some master, and no one knew, and they basically hit a jackpot. But that is not something most buyers of art want to do, right? It's to hope to get lucky. They want to go to a gallery and they want to know that there's a certain level of quality or interest or whatever. And that's sort of what the gallery does. Is that fair to
Also
say? Is there
guarantee
something
of
more to it?
authenticity.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. Right. Right. So it's a filtering mechanism in terms of quality, and that this is by who it says it is by, and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you've got a good gallerist, of course, they're gonna make sure that you don't get oversaturated. They're gonna make sure that that you're kind of written about and placed in a certain way that's advantageous for your work. They're going to be people that have the social connections that will get the right kind of collectors towards your work. So yeah, they are very much managed. I mean, it's not just a place that flog your pictures. They're also kind of managing aspects of your career. So there is value, I mean, in what they do, and the commission to some degree is certainly fair, especially if you're someone that's that's just sort of starting your career. That is it's a great advantage to have a good gallerist.
So some of the managers of famous musicians became famous in and of themselves. Who is the Colonel with Elvis? Anyway, people like this. And I think the Beatles manager is a name that I would know if I cared more
Epstein,
about the Beatles.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Brian Epstein and Albert Grossman of Bob Dylan. Yeah.
Albert Grossman. Right. Is there an equivalent? I mean, it sounds like the gallery sometimes plays a little bit of that kind of role, managing the presentation of your work to the market.
Oh, yeah.
But are there just personal agents or dealers, or are they called art dealers? What is that role in the fine art world? I'm unfamiliar with it.
Dee, do you want to take this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, they're called art dealers. I actually mentioned some by name. So I mentioned Larry Gagosian. Ileana Sonnabend, Leo Castelli, Thomas Amann. There are many of these people who actually become kind of famous in their own right.
But you're saying they would have a relationship with the artist?
Pierre Matisse.
You're saying that
Matisse,
they'd be managing the artist's career in some sense?
Often they have personal connections to the artist. So, for example, Pierre Matisse, son of Henri Matisse, famous painter, was Juan Miro's personal dealer, and he was very chummy with him, very supportive. They had very good connections. He was also doing a lot for him during the war, trying to get him supplies, trying to get him food and stuff, and basic stuff during the Second World War. So sometimes they can be very friendly. Art in the 20th century is full of strong relationships between art dealers and famous artists, and they do in some cases actually make the reputation of the artist, and they are very, very important. And they have huge influence, and they also become extremely wealthy.
Yeah.
Okay, so they will really serve the function of an agent.
Many artists they really want to get with a certain gallerist. With the case of Warhol, he desperately wanted Leo Castelli to give him a show and to represent him, which he eventually did get representation. So there are certain dealers that artists they want that relationship because it can be very advantageous for them.
Right. Yeah, and I've heard of artists, not naming any names, who whine about their art dealer, but there is
find me one who doesn't.
Yeah, exactly.
but there it seems to me, speaking from sort of an economic mindset, right? It seems like one of those division of labor things. It's like Academic Agent was just saying in a recent video, you're not going to be best at everything, right? You have the thing that you're good at. For an artist, hopefully it's producing art, and that because you're good at producing art doesn't necessarily mean that you're good at having connections. You're good at explaining this art as something that other people would be interested in, right? I mean, there's all these gifts and skills, and sometimes you find one person who has a couple of them at once. Extraordinary people, right? Have a talent stack, as Scott Adams calls it. But much more commonly, your focus is, for good reason, your craft, and there's plenty to do just getting that right without trying to add a whole nother set of skills on top of it, right?
And also being an artist and being an art dealer, they're both immensely time consuming. and you need to be in different places. You know, you can't be in the gallery
Right.
if you're making art. You know, you can't be chasing up leads. You can't be making phone calls. You can't be going to, you know, like parties in the evening, trying to make connections and handing out invitations and stuff. If you're also being the artist, so it's absolutely not possible to represent yourself at anywhere near a professional level on your own. It's absolutely not possible.
Yeah, exactly right. And you know, I mean, personally, I don't have any interest in the social niceties involved in making these sorts of connections and sales and such. So it is very useful to have someone who, of course, does that professionally, and will also work with other people who do that professionally. So yes,
so you're not at you're not at your openings, going around palling around with people and telling them.
I famously, well, I don't want to say famously, but I do not go to openings. I mean, that's been thrown up in the air because of the Corona thing. The future of the art opening is perhaps
sure, but even before 2020, you just wouldn't
do
go.
It because I don't. I mean, it's something that's absolutely beyond me and not my interest at all. I mean, but you know, so yes, your dealer can act as a shield between you and the world at large, and that to people, to sort of antisocial types such as myself, that is very, very useful.
And also the openings represent, you know, maybe one evening every 9 months or every 18 months. So it's not really much of a sacrifice.
No, it's not a big deal, you know. I mean, now, of course, I will and have many times met socially with people who collect, or who have purchased my work. I mean, that because that's a different thing, you know. But the idea of sort of going to a party is just not in my purview. But I mean, you do have to make certain concessions to kind of social niceties with people who are your bread and butter. But but yes, the dealer can kind of help buffer that, you know, provide a buffer between you and that aspect of the
so help me understand when the dealer comes in, when we talk about the levels of you know, we talked about that graph, right? If you are at the point where you are supporting yourself with your art, that first tranche of people who are above zero, right? Well, that wouldn't be the first tranche, but let's move right to that tranche. Those people who are able to live from their art, that is their full-time job, and that is how they support themselves, their family, etc. Would they pretty much 100% have dealer agents, whatever you want to call them?
I would say most of them probably do, unless they're doing things like portraits, society portraits, or they're painting horses, or they're painting sort of views of houses and stuff. In which case, they're probably getting referrals, and they don't need an agent. And this is very to be snobbish about it. This is relatively low level. It's not the sort of stuff that's going to get you into museums. You're not going to get onto the front cover of Freeze magazine or whatever. But you're making a good living, and that's not to be sniffed at all. And I've got a lot of respect for them as artists. But they don't need agents and
absolutely, and that's and I mean, it's an ancient tradition. You know, I mean, you know, certainly the portrait aspect of that, or you know, that is it is an aspect of being an artist that goes back, you know, many hundreds of years. So yes, that's certainly a viable thing. And also, you know, having a dealer doesn't mean that your dealer is one of these big blue chip galleries. I mean, there's certainly local galleries that will also represent and sell artists' work, and they provide the same function, just at a smaller scale, or a more kind of local scale. So and you can also have multiple dealers, like, so you will often have like someone that handles your work in on the continent, and someone handles your work elsewhere if you're of a certain level, you know. So yeah, there's all sorts of arrangements that happen around this, and as I said, there's a big multiplicity of this. There's not just one way this works. There's different ways depending upon the situation and location, and you know, and level of money we're talking about.
Shall I give you some mind-blowing figures about what artists make?
Yeah,
I have some data here for you. So this is part of something which you may or may not be, well, which you will be able to read next year. One survey discovered that the median income for fine artists in 2010 in the UK was £10,000. That's less than half the national income, average income. By 2015, the average annual income from art for a British artist fell to roughly £6,000 out of a total income of £16,500 from all income, from all sources. So that means they're doing other stuff as well for money. 69% of artists needed paid employment. 36% of artists earned a negligible £1,000 or less. So that's 36% of artists earn practically nothing from their art.
Right.
So
right.
There you are.
Yeah, which fits what you were saying about the shape of that curve, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so though it annoys my far right friends, this channel does have a certain theme of liberty and loathing for liberty's great enemy, the state. So let's bring the state in, having set, I think, a lot of the pieces in place to understand the different moving parts. Let's talk about the state. First of all, governments were kings, whatever, various forms of governing folks were always patrons. They were always people, purchasers or patrons, right? That's not new. So I don't want to act like it's new. It isn't. It isn't new. Now, whether the scale of it is perhaps new, we need to think about. But that role is not new. But it does seem like some things have changed. One thing you already referred to is that the state subsidizes higher education. And so you talked about a glut of people with fine arts degrees. But of course, there's a glut of all kinds of things. It's not just fine arts degrees, right? And we just have, too many overproduction of elites is how we say it in our circles, right? We just have too many people coming out thinking they've got a ticket to, life at a higher level, and some of them get that, and many of them don't. They just are a waitress with a fine arts degree or a humanities degree of some sort, right? So there's that aspect of it, which I think we already talked about it. I don't know if there's much more to say, which is just simply that you've got a lot of people who come out of university thinking that they're going to make a living selling art. And
something maybe we should add, something we should maybe also add is that they're not coming out with particular skills. Most of the time, they're not coming out as a trained painter. They have to train themselves, sometimes after they leave college, because they're not being taught practical skills. Right. So they're not coming into the market ready to work. They're also not coming in as particularly flexible. So as Dee said, in the past, artists had to be able to do many things. They had to be able to paint altarpieces. They had to paint portraits. They had to be able to paint furniture sometimes. But you're getting artists coming out who often are not skilled at all. They're just conversant in theory, and they've done lots of debates, and they've read some sort of some secondhand philosophy. So so they're not coming into the market with particularly great skills.
Nor are they coming in with any kind of grasp on the reality of these situations generally. I mean, it's almost, I mean, not to go down that road, but it's almost criminal what's done in the art school business to young people, some of whom of course have extraordinary talent that is wasted with these sorts of education. So yes, I would certainly agree.
I shared the Art Renewal Center. John D may have some disagreements with their point of view because they're rather strong on representational figurative art and so forth. But anyway, leaving that aside, they do have that emphasis that I mentioned with the New York Academy of Art that Warhol co-founded. Basically, we need a place that can teach some of just the skills, just the raw skills that it seems like we're almost in danger of getting lost at a certain point. Anyway, it's because of Art Renewal Center that I know the term atelier, which I can't say very well because I don't know French. And an atelier is that old style master and apprentice sort of arrangement, right? Correct. Which I didn't even know this, but you mentioned that the apprentice would actually pay back in the day, and I don't know if that's done much anymore, or maybe it is. I don't know. But I think the number of atelier arrangements had fallen precipitously low at a certain point in the 20th century. It actually has swung up since then. There's actually more going on, and you can find them. At one time, it would have been quite difficult. You can probably find one in your country. And at one time, you probably would have had to go to Italy or something like that to find
Yeah,
it.
they do exist in Britain. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I bring it up to say that when you say that the schools kind of don't give you those kinds of things, the universities don't seem to have that atelier mindset in general. Obviously,
Yeah, it's the universities.
you can probably find some place. Yeah, you can probably find some place where there's a marvelous department where they somehow are existing in the university system, but effectively they're passing on the real skills, right? But I would say, if you're sending your children off to art school, you want to be aware of what exactly you're purchasing with your arts degree, right? And if you're thinking, I see some giftedness in painting, like with my 15-year-old daughter, I see some giftedness in painting, I'll send them to some big name university, right? A university that has a big name because of other aspects of it, right? A Harvard or Yale, I don't know what their art schools are like, but some university, hey, there's a big name, I'll send them to the art school there and they will come out a better painter, right? Well, maybe, but very possibly not. It's fair to say.
In fact,
right?
I'd say almost certainly not.
They'll come out as a feminist performance artist.
Yeah, and I should say this isn't a problem confined to just art. It would be the same if you sent your son or daughter to go and study literature. Well, they're not going to study literature. So yes, this is a pervasive.
It's
problem,
a big problem.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, and a quick anecdote. My friend Don Wiegand, he was at Washington University in St. Louis, our big university here, which at the time was probably not big in name, but now it's in the top 10 U.S. universities, I think, or it comes in and out of the top 10. So it's done well. It's where I did a degree and sort of a second degree in political economy. And he was doing more representational art, at least at that time. Sculpture, and the conflict between at that time, this would have been going back, so this would have been the late 50s, 60s, somewhere around that era. He would come in the morning and find that his clays had been vandalized. So that sort of blew my mind. To me, it just would never occur. Even if I didn't like your art, it would never occur to vandalize. It would never occur to me to vandalize your art, even if I didn't think much of it, But this is something he said happened more than once, and that I was stunned by that, But anyway, just a little hint that the university, just because it says art school on the label on the 10, you have to look under the label. I would say. In fact, I would go so far.
Because it says university on the label doesn't mean it's university.
Absolutely, yeah. I would go so far as to say, and of course I'm thinking about this because those who follow me on Twitter have seen that I've shared some of the art from my 15-year-old daughter, and she seems to show some talent and might want to pursue it, or she is pursuing it, I should say, and might want to pursue it further. And so from my point of view, I basically just listen to artists that are good artists. We have some friends who are good artists, and I ask them for where can she get trained? What universities aren't a joke? I mean, I'm not going to go to the university and trust them. I'm going to look for someone who actually has skills and says, yes, these are places where you can gain the sorts of skills I have, right? So anyway, back to the state, right? So they produce a bunch of people with art degrees who don't necessarily know how to make art. So that's an aspect. Then there's the whole issue of subsidies. So have to be careful here, because you could just say, right, Alexander, that this is what is the difference between the modern state's art subsidies and the king, purchasing an altarpiece or a painting or something like that. But I get the feeling that something has changed, and it isn't. In one sense, it's the same, but in another sense, I think maybe the scale is bigger. Contrast, please, for us, Alexander.
Okay, well, I would say that the difference is that everything that the king or a prince or a bishop commissioned, had a specific function and a particular use, and it was intended to be kept and cherished, and it had a certain innate value in its material qualities. I would say that the government basically has budgets that it has to empty every year, and that money is going to all sorts of projects that have not necessarily any artistic quality at all, because we've got even now to the stage of performance art to conceptual art, where you're not even talking about material products anymore. So these are notional goods with notional social utility. So in Britain, we have the national government, which gives direct money to certain things like the National Gallery, the Tate Gallery, the British Library, the British Museum. So these are international bodies. They're a bit bloated, but they have a lot of very important stuff in them. I mean, they've got some nonsense there, but basically it's good stuff. And these institutions should exist, I believe. And I think that they should also be funded by the state. The government also gives a large chunk of money to the Arts Council, which is divided into regional groups. And this gives money to local venues, local charities, publications, artists, and special projects. And these can be very diverse. The grants can be relatively low. You know, it might be sort of £5,000 or something. It could be up to £20,000, £30,000. Obviously, organisations get more than individuals. I should also point out that actually I did once get an Arts Council grant right at the beginning of my career for my first exhibition, and that money was spent on publishing a catalogue and buying frames and stuff. So it can be useful to young artists. But there are artists who start off their entire careers on the basis of public subsidy. I should also mention the government art collection. Government also buys pictures for its own offices. The British Council, which is basically the foreign arm. So this is where the British Council has its representatives in international places, and they sometimes sponsor art exhibitions. They sometimes do touring shows. Money also goes into public commissions, like public sculptures. This is also done by public local government. So, for example, if you're a young artist and you're let's say the right skin color, let's say the right religion, let's say the right ethnicity, the right sexual orientation or whatever, you've got a good chance that the government you'll be exhibiting in a government-funded small venue. The government may buy some of your art. You may get a part in one of the touring shows in a British Council exhibition. You may get a solo exhibition at a local venue. That venue may also buy some paintings from you. That exhibition may also be reviewed by the Art Monthly magazine, which is also funded by the state. So you can have a 5-year career and never appeal to a private collector, never appeal to the public, never appeal to even a critic, but you can still establish yourself all on public money.
Right. So this seems like a weird thing to say, because I mean, a king commissions a portrait of himself or of a battle that he won or whatever, right? But it almost feels like art could potentially be state-funded art could potentially be more politicized in some sense. Do you follow me?
Yeah. Yeah, very much. I mean, I'll say something short, and then Dee can come in. So, for example, I would say that states have always used art for soft power. They've always used them for prestige. So you commission something after a battle, or you commission something, to mark a landmark treaty, or a dynastic marriage or something. But today, the state tends to fund art. For example, something that I said that you commission art to say, we're a diverse and welcoming nation, and we've got plenty of ethnic minorities who make great art. So you may want to come here and spend your money on our tourism, and also our technology is top class. So this is kind of like a soft power way of selling the state abroad, for example.
Mr. D, any thoughts on?
I don't really have anything to add to it. I think Alexander covered that very well. yes, and I think that of course there's the implicit idea that if you're being subsidized by the state and you're being promoted by the state, then you of course present no threat at all to the state. That you
Right.
are sufficiently neutralized as to be acceptable. And I again, I don't know if that's a position that one would want to be in, because
You're
of
a
course,
client of the state.
yeah, because of course, and that could change. Your status could change very rapidly. But yes, of course, this goes on, and this has always gone on to some degree. There's another aspect where art becomes subsidized by the state, which is, I think, a much more murky area, which is that to some degree the work produced in a nation, or by the inhabitants of that nation, is a part of the cultural heritage of that nation. And so we have an organization like the National Trust, which is ostensibly, well, certainly was founded as a trust for the care of estates, which and other properties which had importance to the cultural life of the nation and the history of the nation. And the same goes for kind of museums that collect and keep and conserve and guard the artwork that is a part of that cultural history. So of course that is also an arm of the state in a way, because of course those entities are subsidized either partly or wholly by money, public monies. So I think this is a much more difficult question, is because to what degree, do we sort of encourage that? I mean, is it in the interest of the state to sort of safeguard these things? And I think you would have less opposition to that than you do now, because of course now we have these organizations such as the National Trust getting into some very, I would say, going down some very nasty paths, basically making exhibitions in some of these houses which were given to the National Trust, given to the nation, being used for kind of political propaganda of the worst sort. How white supremacy built this
Right.
estate, and
Yeah.
museums are doing it. The museums are doing it as well with our cultural history. So at once they're both kind of charged with keeping it, and in another sense it's being used in a negative way. Rather than being propaganda that pushes an idea, it's being used as a kind of almost the degenerate art example. This is a negative thing. This is something you don't want to do. This is a bad example of our culture. So there's a very dangerous two-way street there.
Right. So I think we had this idea, this sort of implicit understanding and contract, right, that the state would want to preserve the history of us or something, right, of the people over whom it has ruled and so forth. And I think it's maybe come as a shock to find that the state would take those things entrusted to it and essentially would like to burn them if they could get away with it, right? I mean, at least some of them would like to do that. They would like to destroy that heritage they've been entrusted with. And I kind of suspect no one really saw this coming, that the National Trust would hate the history of England and want to burn it.
Yeah. and you've got people who are actually working in museums. When there was all this, the iconoclasm of 2020, which I documented in my book, when I researched it, I found examples of museum curators advising rioters on how to destroy statues, on how to topple, the sort of various things. And they were actually making public tweets and encouraging this.
I was actually blocked by one famous example of that, a woman who, I can't remember where she worked. She did work for a small kind of local museum, and she was giving advice on what to throw at a bronze sculpture to ruin it. Now, of course, she was so incompetent, as many people.
Royston Museum.
Yes, that's it. She was so incompetent, as many people of her ilk are, that she was giving them the wrong chemical advice, and it wouldn't have done any damage whatsoever. But still, the idea is you have someone who works for an institution that is meant to care for these
Right.
things, literally
Yeah.
telling
Okay. Well,
people how to
I,
destroy them. So
I know the right literary reference to make here, guys. It's Fahrenheit 451, right? Where the fireman
oh,
is in charge of burning
yep,
things down instead of stopping the fires.
Yeah.
That's what you're literally
yep.
describing, right? The preservers of culture view themselves as needing to destroy that heritage, destroy that deposit from the past, as opposed to preserving it, right?
And there
So
is
it's
reason
literally
to
the
fear.
fireman.
There is reason to fear for the safety of the artifacts of our cultural history. I think
Oh,
because there
absolutely.
are very dangerous people now ensconced at every level in many institutions that would like nothing more than to see this sort of thing burn. Well,
This
whether
gives
it
me a
be
great idea.
Warhol or Ruskin or anyone else, I mean,
Yeah.
they're not limited in their scope.
This gives me a
I
great idea
recently,
for a fictional. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Alexander.
oh, sorry, I just recently reviewed an exhibition of, no, it's actually a catalogue for an exhibition of Canadian art. Early 20th century Canadian landscapes are fantastic. They're really amazing. You've got to look them up. And there was this exhibition catalogue which had this most beautiful works in it. And the curators in it were berating the artists for being colonizers, for being for overlooking the indigenous population, for sort of supporting the destruction of habitat and stuff like that. And these curators who were in charge of the museums with this art, they clearly disliked, even hated the art that the public loved. And there's a great schism between what the elite want to destroy and the way the public love that culture.
I'm put in mind of a fictional story one could imagine, purely fiction, just a great idea for a story, where you have a sort of a modern day Robin Hood who steals the cultural artifacts from the people who are putting it in danger, not for their personal gain, but just so that it can be truly preserved and not, treated badly, Anyway, okay. So what else about the state? Right. So the state has always funded art that it viewed as serving its own ends. I mean, I don't think that's new and shocking. Or the governing bodies would, they would want hagiography of some sort, right? They want something that makes them look good in whatever sense. These days, the things that they feel make themselves look good look a little bit different, but this because they have sort of a different sort of morality and view of the world, right, than in the past. And so they would feel that it makes them look good to denigrate the past of England or something, right? Yeah, that's part of a social signaling for them at this point. But if you sort of step back from that a little bit, it's still the state, funding or using art to serve its own ends. I don't think that's new or shocking. I guess here's one thing I was old enough to remember the Robert Mapplethorpe business, right? How can we tell the story extremely briefly for the younglings? Basically, he, I think, was a genuinely skilled artist, as Mr. D pointed out to me, showed me some work of his that was very impressive. A genuinely skilled photographer, but he also did some stuff that was very sexually explicit and so forth. And I think, was there some? No, I'm mixing it up. Did he have some anti-Christian stuff? I might be missing that up. I'm thinking of Piss
Serrano.
Christ. Who was that?
Yeah.
Serrano. Yeah. Sorry.
Andre Serrano.
Anyway, but Mapplethorpe had some. Yeah, Mapplethorpe had some. Very sexually explicit stuff, and somebody made a big fuss that state funding was involved.
Jesse Helms.
Right. Yeah, Jesse Helms. Right. And so for a while there was a big discussion about art funding and why is the state involved in this at all, and how do we decide what the state funds? I mean, are they in any sense representing what the people want? But as Mr. D has pointed out to me, fine art at the higher levels has never been for the plebs anyway. So do we really want democracy to be to be determining fine art? Probably not. It's not as not good as that, not good as that at that as it is not good at anything else. But it makes me wonder, though, even though there was that big fuss and they talked about the figures involved, when you talk about the private collectors, there seems to be a great deal of money involved there as well. So how big of a piece of the pie is state subsidies of art and so forth? And is it dominant in terms of the money sloshing around in the art world? Is it a small piece? Is it half of it? Do you have some sense? I guess I'm trying to figure out when they throw their weight around,
maybe
how much of an effect does it really have?
I would say that it depends upon how you want to gauge that. If you're talking about the kind of promotion of a single artist's sort of living artist, currently working artist's work, I would say that it's fairly small. But if you're getting into the idea of, the how work gets kind of promoted, again, the kind of public collections and things like that, all being under the aegis of the state, then of course it's going to be a more significant percentage. But I don't know what the split is. I would say that if you're talking about just in terms of dollars, it's small compared to the.
Okay.
If you added up all the kind of private markets and such, it's a fairly small part of it. But it's that's just in financial terms. I think in regards to its kind of prominence and importance, I think it is a bigger share.
You're saying primarily because of its. Go ahead.
Sorry, I think certainly for the prestige end. Yeah. So for things like the Royal Academy, for the Tate, the National Gallery, for public commissions, for big public stuff, those artists are massively supported by the state. Now, they're also quite popular as well, but then there's a lower tier of the contemporary artists, of the younger generation artists who get those plum commissions, as it were, who get the prestigious spots, who get the solo exhibitions. They are disproportionately boosted by the state. I think for the vast majority of working artists, they get almost nothing from the state.
Yeah, I guess and this is really hard to get our hands around probably, but just I wish I had some sense of how much is the state really influencing the direction of art. I mean, you've heard about what the CIA being involved in abstract expression, pushing abstract expressionism and stuff like that. And I think some people take that to mean that if not for the CIA, there wouldn't have been abstract expressionism. I kind of suspect that's not true.
Yeah, no, that's a ridiculous assertion. Yeah, I get people that lob this at me, of course, because I famously am, like all sorts of quote degenerate artwork. But yeah. I mean, I think that you also have to understand that there's a very blurred line between what constitutes the state and what constitutes the elites of these organizations, the elites of the all aspects of this world, because of course they're going to be the same people in many in many instances, and they're certainly
the same class,
the same class of people.
Yes.
So they're going to have their own tastes and prejudices and such, which will kind of permeate both worlds. So I think it's not so cut and dried, so to speak.
Yeah. There's interplay between the culture of at least a certain set and the state, and they influence each other. It's fair to say, right? I forgot to mention it, but just back when we were talking about, people, essentially artists being funded by the state, and then back to the striking the pose bit, striking the pose as, I am a transgressive artist. I am someone who really, I'm questioning the system, and then you find out that, like you said, Alexander, their whole career has basically been state funded, and I feel like we have many examples of this, right? People who present themselves as edgy and rebellious, and they're as academic agent put it so beautifully, they're pushing at an open door, You know,
Yeah.
they
I mean,
really
the
are
most
not. They're not persecuted. You know.
no, the most transgressive art you could do now are kind of traditional female nudes in an academic fashion. You know, I mean, if you want to be transgressive, I mean, I'm afraid that's where the transgression is now. I mean, to anyone who would describe someone like Damien Hirst as being transgressive, it's a ridiculous idea.
Right.
Yeah.
Bouguereau time travels here and gets stoned. Right.
Exactly.
He just gets executed in the public square. You know.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, have we missed any corners? I mean, it's sort of been a a bit of a plan, but a little bit scattered approach. We've talked about primary and secondary markets. We've talked about art as investment and free ports, tax havens, the role of auctions, museums, galleries, art dealers who effectively are something like what we think of as agents in the world of music. They can have that same role with an artist, right, where they're really in partnership effectively with an artist. And then finally, of course, we had to talk about the state, which, as a libertarian, I suspect that the state has a bad influence on art and culture and so forth. But it would take some connecting the dots to really figure it out. In particular, AA has been talking about culture being downstream from the law. I don't know what laws were changed. That's something where you have to really dig and research to understand. What
institutional creep. It's budget creep, isn't it?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and when you talk about, by the way, I happen to work for a Fortune 100, Alexander. So when you talk about, you got to spend the money or you lose it or whatever, yeah, I totally get it. It happens with big companies, and it happens with governments even worse, of course, where they're just gonna shove the money out the door, and it may not make much sense, right? But if they don't, then their budget gets cut next year. So they go ahead and pour it on something, maybe influenced by their own political predilections, right? Right. Okay. So I guess we could finish with, unless you feel like there's some big component we've missed of discussing the art market, just maybe summarize. You've already covered it well in another interview, Alexander, but summarize a little bit of, you've encouraged people to get involved, which was interesting to me. And maybe because of what I pointed out before, that this isn't a massive market in the sense of the number of people that are interested in it, right? And so, if you don't like how your local, you call it a council in the UK, but here, your local city government or state government or whatever, if you don't like what they're doing with the arts, this is an area where speaking up, you'd be surprised. You might get heard, is what you're saying, right, Alexander?
Yeah. So basically, I'm saying it is possible to influence. For example, I mean, I'm not going to go into the details here, but there's an art institution in London called the ICA, which is spending money earmarked for arts on basically on political campaigning, and this is actually illegal.
Right.
So what I've done is I've written to the government, to the Culture Secretary, and to the Charities Commission, because of course it's a tax-free charity which is supposed to be doing artwork, but it's not doing artwork. And theoretically, of course, now all these people are part of the same elite who kind of in sympathy with the political aims of this venue, which is breaking the rules. So of course they're not really going to police it very, very much. But if you can get your voice heard, if you can get it out in society, and you can get things in newspapers, you can write to your MPs and stuff. I don't know, it doesn't really change that much, but I think it's incumbent on us to actually do something about it. There is a possibility that you might get, an organization might get reprimanded. It might get fined. It might get struck off the charities register, or maybe it will just tone down what it does. Even if it's just a little bit, you've done something. And I know you haven't won a victory. You haven't changed the overall course. We're still sort of going down the mountain, down the ravine towards entropy, but you've done something. You've slowed the progress. So I would say, yes, you can do things. And one of the things that people in Britain that maybe they can, if they're interested in going to the event, AA's event at the end of August, I'll be speaking there, and I'll be saying basically setting out positive vision for ways of influencing culture. And so maybe if you can't make that event, also I believe there will be a book, and my talk will be in that book. So maybe you want to buy that book. I'm not going to get any money from that book, but that will be like a blueprint for things that we can do.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, there, in our circles, as you probably picked up on, Alexander, I don't know how much you've been around these things, but there is a lot of black pilling, right? There's a lot of doom and gloom. Yeah. And I do personally tend to have a more, I like to look for signs of hope and signs of positive change. And, you know, as I said, with the Art Renewal Center, one of the things that was surprising to me is that they said, you know, the sort of the nadir of the teaching of art skills and some of the traditional skills of painting and so forth. The nadir of that is actually in the past, and we're actually coming up from a low point at this point. So I think people on the outside might think that just everything culturally is degrading and going lower and worse, and skills being lost and traditions being lost and so on and so forth. But I think in the world of art, that's not quite true. I think that it was at a very scary point, but that's some decades ago now. You know what I'm talking about, right, Alexander?
Yeah, and I think that there is an option. So you do have the atelier system, you do have a revival in crafts, you do have you know, more options becoming available, and I think that there is the possibility of sort of building some of these Benedictine monasteries to preserve the skills of art, not necessarily traditional art, not necessarily using traditional materials, but that can be part of it. So I'm not an aesthetic conservative by any means, but I think that we should be preserving our skills and preserving the canon and teaching the canon, and that's something we can do at a very small scale.
And that's a very important point to make, and I'm very happy that you made it, because this isn't just sort of saying, oh, we need to promote this sort of particular way of working. Every skill is being degraded. Every sort of ability to do anything. You know, I mean, there are people being produced who couldn't even produce a Jackson Pollock at this point. You know, so yes, I mean there is a great need for you know, and I think that, you know, obviously I don't think you should enter into any dialogue with art without understanding, of course, the canon, the Western canon, as well as, you know, the canon of many different places across the world. I mean, I think it's very, very important, and it's something that is that needs to be preserved. And so, yes, I mean, even if you're not of a traditional bent aesthetically, it doesn't matter, because, of course, everything is a target. You know, and it only stays alive if we keep it alive. You know, people talk about, you know, well, we can't do anything, we can't fight against these forces. Well, it's just like Stephen, you mentioned Fahrenheit 451. I mean, the way they dealt with that was that everyone learned a book. You know, everyone memorized a book, and they were the keepers of this tradition that was sort of, you know, the firemen couldn't get to, and in a way we have to think of ourselves as that. I mean, these traditions only pass to the next generation if we keep the candle burning, so to speak. So yes, I mean, it's not hopeless at all. I mean, and it is something that requires definitive action on our part. So yeah, you certainly don't. This is an area where you don't want to accept the whole black pill nonsense. You know, you really can make a difference.
Yeah, well, I think that goes back to what I said about sort of the size of the art world. You know, you find someone, maybe my daughter's one of them, I don't know. You find someone who seems to be really serious about it. They really put the time in, right? And you hand them a book. What's that, John Ruskin that you love so much, John D, right? You hand them a John Ruskin book, and they start working their way through it, you know? Right? In other words, you've got someone who really doesn't want to just go and have political speeches. They really want to master a craft, the craft of it, the skill of it, right? How many people like that are there? You know, we have a ton of people coming out of art schools, right? but how many are really, you know, when no one's looking and no one's telling them to do it, they're at their canvas working, you know, because this is what they're about, right? There's always people like this in music and
Yep.
art and so forth. It's just their passion, it's who they are. Well, you can encourage one of those people, right? You can encourage them. You can help them go to get some training, you know, so on and so forth, right? And there aren't that many of them around, I think, in the grand scale of things. We're not talking about tens of millions, I don't think, especially in your local area, right? That probably
Nor has there ever
probably
nor
meet a
has
lot
there
of
ever
them.
been.
Yeah,
Nor
yeah,
has
yeah.
there ever been, you know. So
Right.
yes,
So
I
so
mean,
so
and that is how you keep it
you-
alive.
Right. And so my point is, you can actually make a difference. I mean, you know, we hear these stories of, you know, the one person who bought a Van Gogh or whatever, right? Because he only sold like one, right? I mean, you could be the one who someday the story is told that, you know, no one really believed in this artist, but this one person saw that a little bit of help right now could make a difference, and they gave them that help, and they went on to really develop into a great artist, you know. So it is one of those things. It's an area where I think we're not so powerless, where in some other areas we feel quite powerless. I think that's not the case in art. And like I said, I think that the loss of skills, the dangerous loss of skills, we're already past that point, and now people are you can learn those skills again, and there's opportunity to do that, you know. So my producer, I love saying that, my producer makes me feel important. He said, we haven't addressed the title. Why are artists poor? Okay, well, I think we addressed it in one sense, but then maybe Alexander, you can make some more comments, and then we'll do a couple super chats.
Okay, I can do it very simply.
We addressed it in one sense. Okay, go ahead.
Basically, it's overproduction of artists due to state subsidies, and also the state encouraging, sort of telling people you can be whatever you want. It's not true. Don't do it. Don't think like that. So too many artists are produced by state subsidy. There's also direct state subsidy through arts organizations, which is encouraging people who are not economically productive to stay in the field. This depresses wages. There is not a means of gatekeeping who is and is not an artist. That also provides a surplus of producers compared to a relatively low number of consumers who will pay a high amount of money. This suppresses wages. Also, there is the prestige of being an artist. There's no prestige in being a carpenter who can't make a living. There's plenty of prestige in being an artist who can't make a living. So there is a perverse incentive for people to be poor, because it's a sign of authenticity. And as we said, poorness is authenticity, and authenticity is a sign of genuineness, of genuine art. So this unfortunately sustains an oversupply of artists, and that's basically why artists are poor.
Right. I'm reminded a little bit, Alexander, of the world of acting. I had a friend who was putting out a call for actors in New York City. Okay. I didn't know. I always thought of actors going to LA. There's actually a bunch of actors in New York City. Well, there's the theater there, right? Anyway, so he puts out a call for actors, and he says, I will give you pizza, and you can be part of my little thing I'm doing. And he had hundreds of applications, all with the headshot, and, you know, I've been to Juilliard or whatever, you know, right? I mean, it's nuts.
Yeah, there's so many artists. Artists will actually work for free, which is cutting the price of art down to almost nothing, which is terrible for people who want to be professional artists.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's cover a couple things. Robert Emmett Walsh says, why are artists poor? Because they are bad. Great stream, great guests. Alex is based. Very kind comment to Alex there. Listen to this.
Thank you
I
very
thought
much.
this is good. This is from your article, I think, or were you quoting the book? Anyway, the lack of reward in a perverse way validates a financially unsuccessful career. It shows how selfless and dedicated an artist has been, when in reality, it might just indicate that this artist is no good. I thought that was funny. Okay, and then couple super chats. Greetings from Matthias. He says hi to D from Matthias, because Matthias loves our Danish Svengalis. Yeah, you may not know Matthias is the producer of this show, John D. He's
Yes,
the
I figured
reason.
that I figured that out
Yeah,
during
yeah.
during this whole process. Yeah.
Yeah. He's the reason that we've got the nice graphic design and stepping things up, and we'll continue to step things up as funds allow. Then Hussein Badakchani says, Radlib, great topic, and wonderful guests. Will Bitcoin fix art? Alluding to the arguments of Saifuddin Ammous of the Bitcoin Standard, debasing currency debases art, which is a private currency. Yeah, I was afraid to get into this because it's a whole rabbit hole into itself. In fact, let me share a stream where I did get into it a little bit. I did cover art on this show recently in one called Certificates for Nothing. And I will share that with the stream right now. And that was dealing with a funny case recently that you might have heard of, Alexander, where someone sold a statue that is invisible, not there, that is to say, for John D said it was not that much money in the world of fine art, but it was £13,000. It sounded like a lot to me. And what they got for this was a certificate saying that you have this invisible statue.
That also relates to NFTs, which I don't think I'm qualified to talk on, but I know it came up in the chat.
No idea about any of that. So,
I would say this though. When you brought up that there was a glut of artists in the Lowlands at one point, I have to wonder if that was around the time of the. Have you heard of the tulip?
Yes, it was
bubble.
I mean, it certainly was in that period. Yeah.
How did I know? Yeah, well, these things tend to go together, right? You get in a bubble. People are looking for places to park money. Everything gets bid up, and you start seeing like really insane prices. Now, I don't know if you guys have followed it well enough. I wonder if the top selling paintings or whatever, those prices have just gone up and up and up for the last 70 years, or you would actually see a pattern to them, that sometimes those top selling paintings you're not getting those crazy high sales at certain times than you are at others,
There is occasional constriction in the price. You do get also top works of art not reselling at the same prices for periods of about sort of 5, 10, 15 years, but the general trend is upward.
Yeah. But there is the sense for us Austrians that we are in quite a bubble. And a correction could mean less people getting arts degrees, for example, because people are like, hey, that's a luxury for you to go get a degree that isn't going to result in you getting any income, right? And so you could see less people getting arts degrees, less inflation in the prices of maybe those top selling things, if people are starting to tighten their belt. Art is to some degree a luxury item, right? You can live without it if you have to, though it's as Scruton pointed out, in a way you can't, right? You can't ultimately live without it, but for a time, when things are hard, people are gonna stop spending on art, right? And so you'd see a correction. You'd see some people wash out of the market, right? And it could have a sort of a conservative effect, by which I mean just less crazy prices at the top end for art, and less people who are dilettantes, and more the people who this is really what they're about, being the ones who are still there after the storm blows through, So we could see a big correction in general, and it would affect the art market for sure, in my view. So anyway, and when he says, will Bitcoin fix art, he just means Bitcoin bringing about a harder money, and therefore bring about a correction to sort of inflation in the market. Okay, so I think I addressed my producer and the two places where people send in chats, paid chats, and we have been going quite a long time, and I'm extremely appreciative to Alexander Adams, who not only has shown up here, but like John D, can be found in our, what do you call them? Circle of YouTube, our YouTube family, you might say. Yeah, so the Dolly, which I listened to part one at least. Yeah, I haven't listened to. Have you done? I listened to part one. Has there been another part already?
Yeah, we've done part two. We've got up to his religious paintings, so we've got one more part
Okay.
that will cover his final decades, and that's on Ferro's channel.
Yeah, right. That's on Ferro. Look for Pharaoh on YouTube. If you're not subscribed to him already, you should be. He's definitely in the gang. And then and I had meant to say earlier that I listened to part one of the Dolly and found it quite interesting. Obviously, it's interesting from an artistic point of view, but also Dolly lived through some interesting history, and he had an interesting relationship with the things going on around him. So it's interesting from multiple angles, his story. And then, as we already mentioned, John Dee has been doing something with Academic Agent. He's on Unpopular Opinions every week as the co-host. But there's another show that AA has started called Deepest Lore, where he deals more with arts and culture sort of things. And they've just started a series on Andy Warhol, who is a really interesting person, I think it's fair to say. I mean, Alexander, you haven't mentioned your opinion, but have you found Andy Warhol to be sort of an interesting figure yourself?
Yes, I do actually. I do actually. I'm not sort of sucking up to Dee, but I do completely agree with his interpretation of Warhol as a sort of as a definitely as a religious or as a post-religious artist who had an obsession with morbidity and death. And I do think that Dee's interpretation and his background, that or the context that he's been giving, has been really first class, and I would recommend it very highly to watch the Deepest Law stream with AA, the other AA, not the real AA. I'm the real one, and
Yeah, right.
yeah, I recommend it.
Oh, thank you very much for that. Yes, and we will be doing part two of Warhol on AA's channel next week. Also, I should
next
mention
week.
the fact that Warhol and Salvador Dali were acquaintances in the 1960s and 70s. Yes, so a very strange connection there, but
yeah. Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that if you follow John Dee on Twitter, and occasionally he's had reason to talk about art on other streams, this Warhol series feels like a part of a general mission, or I feel like I've been learning from Dee, which is just to, how do we put it? Don't be low IQ reactionary.
well,
which is just to say anything. Well, let me try to state your mission, and then you correct me. Okay, here's what I get. Here's what I get from you. Don't be low IQ reactionary, and just go, it's from the last 100 years, so it's garbage, and there's nothing to be learned from it. Like in art, go a little deeper, understand the story. I mean, this may sound dumb, but one of the first things that was a little mind blower for me, and I'd already known some things about Warhol because of my old girlfriend and stuff, but is just one of the early paintings you put up right near the beginning of the stream. And like, just that by itself, I was like, oh, this is really good. And he was, what, a teenager at the time or something? This is from the period when his family's like deciding to send him to art school or something, right? And you showed this, it's a painting of their living room. And I'm like, oh, I okay, this guy's got skills, and he's young when he does this, right? So anyway, it's one of the themes of my channel is that I like to surprise people. I like to tell them a part of the story they haven't heard. And so that's what I have been absorbing from John Dee. There's parts of the story that you haven't heard about art, and he is filling it in and giving us a richer, deeper, more complexified view of things. How's that for a marketing bit, Dee?
That's more than I deserve, certainly. I mean, I'm not I should stress I am not an art historian. I'm just a lifelong I'm an artist myself, and a lifelong sort of deep admirer and participant in dialogues and all aspects of art. So yeah, I like the idea of kind of trying to bring an aspect of material that people may sort of overlook, but you can do that with any artist. It's not just the sort of you know, the kind of modern art that that's so very easy to kind of put down. But you know,
Right.
there is something you know, there are dimensions and dimensions behind behind every piece of great art. And so I think people have this. It's very easy to look at a representational painting and think that you understand it, but that is often not the case. And I think that every piece of great art rewards deep study, you know, whatever style or whatever period it's done in. So, you know, don't think just because, you know, it looks pretty that there isn't anything more to it. And there's often, you know, as I said, just a vast a vast dimension. So yeah, if I can get, you know, a few people to think about things and look at things in a different way, then I'm very happy. But thank you for the flattery. I always enjoy it.
Right. Well, you know, art critics are not a necessary part of the world, and I actually really like learning about. This is a trick I've done in my own field, which is writing. I like to learn from writers about writing, and so similarly, in regards to art, I have read some art critics. I'm forgetting the Australian one, if I said his name. The Shock of the New, that guy.
Robert Hughes.
Yeah, Robert Hughes. Yeah, I've read some Hughes, you know. But I have to say, a lot of the things that stick with me the most, and I feel like I learn the best, have been from actual artists. Because I feel like they connect to art in a slightly different way, because they are thinking about what it's like to make art, right? Which is a slightly different perspective than sort of being on the outside of the artistic process, right? So anyway, for that reason, I wouldn't say, oh, John Dee's not an art critic, not an art historian or professional art critic, and therefore you can't really listen to him. I'd sort of think of it almost the other way around. He's an artist, and he has been for a long time, and he's really thoughtful about this stuff. And it's fair to say, Mr. D, you seem to know just a lot of stuff. Like just weird little details about history, art history, right?
Yes, I'm sort of cursed with very good recall for complete nonsense. So, but I mean, to your point, I mean that's another reason that, you know, to listen to Alexander Adams here, because of course, again, he's someone who's also a practitioner, and I think you will find that some of the most insightful writers about art have both been practitioners as well. I mean, we mentioned Ruskin a few times. You know, he's certainly a prime example. Yeah. I mean, even Giorgio Vasari, you know, the kind of original sort of Western art historian in the Renaissance, was both a practitioner and a commentator. So so I think there is definitely value there. That can't be gained from someone who doesn't have a direct, you know, sort of connection to the physical aspect of art making.
Yep, agreed. Well, I thought this might be too niche, but we actually, for my channel at least, we did quite well. I was watching the numbers of people listening, but most of all, I was just very excited. You know, in terms of you know, I've got this producer, I've got a graphic designer trying to bring this channel to the next level. For me, this show is a piece of that. It feels like having you two on, covering this topic, it is, how do I put it? I hope it continues to develop the unique selling proposition, right? That, you know, I've got that economics angle, but then I bring in some actual artists, and we bring some things together that, you know, might not usually all happen at the same time, right? The Austrian economics, along with people who actually produce art and know something about the art market. Anyway, I was just very excited to do it today. So thanks to both of you. John D is more or less a secret. I've hawked him as well as I could. But Alexander Adams, if you look in the description of the show, of the video, you will see a pointer to his webpage, which not only shows his art, but of particular interest to our audience, I think, has the I'm sorry, there's the iconoclasm, and then there's, what's the other one?
Yeah, so it's iconoclasm
wars.
And culture wars. Culture war, yeah. Thanks also to 73 Elephants, who said he'd bought a copy, or she's bought a copy, and also greetings to Turnip as well.
Oh, great, great. Yeah, I would say that it's fair to say, Alexander, that both culture war and iconoclasm are right down the alley of our circle here, right? It's very much of interest. And when you talk about it, just in case someone doesn't know the term, iconoclasm is essentially destroying statues, destroying art, things like
Breaking
that.
images. Yeah.
Right. And so you really, yeah, breaking images. And you wrote this in the wake of the attacks on statues and so forth that we've been seeing, right? But you take a broader view in the book. You're not writing about the last 12 months only. You're writing about hundreds of years, right?
I start from the Old Testament and go all the way through, not comprehensively, but talking about the history, the struggle over images, the destruction of images, and come up to 2020. And hopefully, when you read that section, you'll understand what happened in 2020, not just from the political angle, because you probably know that already, but also it will give you an idea of some of the background.
Right. Well, I just want to say the Canaanite art deserved it. So, okay. All right. Thank you both.